Andrew was 19 years older than Annie. They met by chance at a trade show in New York. Annie came to New York to enter the Institute of Culture, but failed to pass the competition. Deciding the next year to enter again, she did not return to her native Seattle and got a job at the Museum of Art as an assistant museum curator. Annie monitored the safety of exhibits, answered visitors' questions about the content of both the permanent exhibition and temporary exhibitions. Andrew came that day with his wife Cassandra, but she received a phone call and left the exhibition immediately. Andrew wasn't particularly interested, but he stayed. His wife loved exhibitions, and he just wanted to keep her company. Wandering through the halls, Andrew stopped near one painting and thought about something of his own. Annie was nearby. When she noticed Andrew, she thought he was interested and struck up a conversation with him. In my opinion, this is one of the finest works of art. Don't you think so? What? Excuse me? Andrew looked around to make sure this nice girl was addressing him. It's a painting with a very deep meaning. Not everyone sees it. You probably like it too, don't you? I look at it often, and every time I see it, it opens up a new side of me, Annie continued. Yes, she's beautiful. Even though I'm not good at art, Andrew replied. Andrew was not interested in the painting, but he agreed with Annie to keep the conversation going. That's how their conversation started. The relationship between them developed very rapidly. The fact that Andrew was married and had 3 children, Annie was not confused. She was satisfied with the connection with a grown-up wealthy man. Over time, Andrew rented a flat for Annie, began to help financially. Annie left her job at the museum. She had a lot of free time for herself: fitness rooms, beauty salons, regular shopping sessions, restaurants. A well-to-do man, what more could she want? A provincial girl in a big city. She was young, beautiful, and her goal, in addition to the institute, was quite specific. She wanted to settle in the capital at any cost. Andrew met her expectations. Even more than that, Annie considered it a great stroke of luck that they had met. Andrew was a native New Yorker. He had grown up in a full, prosperous family and was an only child. Well-bred, he had 2 higher education, construction and economics. His parents were doctors and dreamed that their only son would follow in their footsteps. But Andrew wanted something else and did not fulfill their hopes. In addition, he greatly disappointed them by marrying a girl, as they believed, not from their circle. The relationship between Andrew and Cassandra's parents improved only after the birth of their first child. They loved their grandchildren and gradually came to terms with their son's choice. In fact, Cassandra was indeed a wonderful mother and a caring wife. Andrew and Cassandra had a good relationship throughout their 16 years of marriage. They respected and supported each other in every circumstance of life. They had to overcome many hardships together. They got married when Andrew did not yet have a fortune. He was an ordinary engineer and achieved everything already in marriage. Andrew's career had its ups and downs, and always by his side was his devoted wife. She accepted all his shortcomings. He tried to be a support for her. They tried to spend time together every weekend. It was trips to Andrew's parents', parks, swimming pools, picnics. The children were the meaning of their lives. Andrew had a beautiful family. Cassandra was a beautiful, tall woman, and in heels she became level with her husband. Luxurious dark hair curled slightly in the wet weather. Refined facial features, long, beautiful fingers and toes. Cassandra had a special elegance, always groomed with makeup, even though she was from a simple family. Cassandra's mother had worked in a bakery for almost 40 years. Their house always smelled of bread and felt cozy. Her father died early. He was a geologist, spent a lot of time in expeditions, constantly traveling around the country in search of new mineral deposits. One day their group was pelted with stones at the exit of a mine. All the geologists managed to escape, except Cassandra's father. She was 15 years old at the time. She remembered her father well. He was a kind and good man, and she dreamed that her future husband would be just as kind and determined. Cassandra was raised with love and respect in her family. She also raised her children. Andrew was proud to have such a woman by his side. He loved and appreciated his spouse. It never occurred to him that there might be another woman in his life. But Annie became a breath of fresh air in Andrew's measured life. She heralded new romantic relationships and long-forgotten notes of flirtation. Andrew could no longer control himself. He had plunged headlong into this maelstrom. In fact, Annie was really beautiful and never felt neglected by men. Her long blonde hair was mesmerizing and made her hold his gaze. Her beauty was natural and her facial features were correct. She was aware of her attractiveness, and it gave her confidence in her relationships with men. Andrew had no chance of not falling under her charm. In the beginning, they hid their relationship, hiding. Andrew was afraid that Cassandra would find out and would not forgive him. But gradually they began to appear together in restaurants and shops. Andrew was so in love that he was happy to fulfill Annie's every whim. And Annie wanted a lot of things. She wanted to go from being a mistress to being a wife. She often talked about their possible future together. And wouldn't it be nice not to have to hide from anyone, but to live the life she wanted? After all, he is a grown man and has the right to his own happy life. Gradually, he began to think so himself. Yes, he fell in love with another woman. That's what happens in life. About 6 months later, Cassandra learned of his affair with Annie. The news came from mutual acquaintances. They are embraced. Everyone saw them at the shopping center. Andrew didn't deny anything. He honestly admitted that his feelings for her had cooled. She could not believe that this man, the closest, dearest, betrayed her. It was very hard for her to accept that there was a woman with whom he felt good, with whom he was happy. And it's not her. It's another woman, young and beautiful. It was unfair, bitter, painful. She felt devastated. The world seemed to have collapsed, and yet Cassandra was a proud woman, and only once did she ask, "Are you ready to trade a life with us for a life with this young girl? Are you so serious that you're sure of your decision?" "Cassandra, don't start, please." "It's not easy for me either, but I've made up my mind," Andrew replied. Cassandra began to pack her and the children's things. "You can stay living here. This is your home." Alivi said, "You don't have to go anywhere. The children are fine here." "I don't even want to stay in this town anymore. I'll file for divorce myself," Cassandra said through her tears. She wanted to go far away, not to see or hear anything about her husband's relationship with his mistress. It was too much to bear. Her mother lived in Nizhny Novgorod. Cassandra herself had been born and raised there. She came to Moscow immediately after graduating from the institute. Her relatives lived there, and they helped Cassandra to settle down, find a place to live and a job. After his wife and children left, Andrew began a new life with Annie. Then it was a wonderful, full of bright colors life. This young person so turned his head that he forgot about the children and was not interested in them. If in the first months after the separation they still occasionally called, he sent money. Then over time the calls became less and less frequent. As well as money transfers, he simply forgot. Work and new relationships demanded a lot of his time. Andrew couldn't get enough of Annie. He watched her sleeping for hours, cooked breakfast in bed, brought her flowers for no reason, wanted to spend all his free time with her. It was crazy. Andrew's parents found out about Andrew and Cassandra's divorce. They didn't like the news at all. They tried several times to talk to their son, urging him to come to his senses. Andrew's mother called Cassandra, asking her to return to New York, promising to help with everything, to help with the children and with work. She hoped that this was a temporary blip in her son's mind, and that very soon he would return to the family. But Cassandra wanted nothing, no help from her mother-in-law, just to be left alone. Andrew began to call his parents less often to avoid listening to their moralizing. Andrew's friends also took the news very badly. They condemned him. Some stopped communicating altogether, and only one married couple of friends accepted his choice. With them, they spent a rare free time. The fate of the former spouse was not the best. Cassandra bought a small flat near her mother, organized the children to school, and went to work. She tried not to think about Andrew, although it was very difficult. The pain did not subside. Her mother was in a cult at the time. Cassandra didn't know about it right away, because such religious organizations were forbidden in our country. They had settled near a small village and outside of the city, so as not to attract attention. It was a rather large settlement, consisting of several houses. People lived there as a community. They would go out in the morning and evening to pray together. During the day, everyone was busy with work. There was also a small, modest household in the vegetable garden. They were always smiling and friendly. Any display of anger was severely punished in the community. They had to attract as many new people as possible. show their love for everyone, tell them how well they were living and call them to follow them. Whole families lived there. If one member of the family disagreed, he or she was simply cut out of the life. The organizer of this movement was an ex-convict who supposedly repented of his sins and saw the truth, and now brings this truth to the masses. Of course, Cassandra was frightened by this. She wanted her mother to get out of there. But she persuaded her daughter to get to know these people and then make a decision. Since Cassandra was deeply unhappy without her husband, she eventually found support and warmth in the circle of these strangers. They had a strong influence on those who were alone and so vulnerable. Everything happened as if in a fog. Gradually, Cassandra signed away all her property to the cult organizer, and she and her mother and children moved to a small house in a remote village near the settlement. It was a quiet and peaceful place. Cassandra even liked it there. She hoped she would feel better here. The people were supportive. They spent a lot of time together. There were no kindergartens in the village, so the children spent all their time outside. The school was 25 kilometers away from the village. They had to get there by bus. The older children did not like all this, but seeing their mother's condition, they kept quiet. Andrew never came home at lunchtime, but this was a special day for him. He walked through the door. He had a huge bouquet of flowers in his hands. Annie met him in the corridor and hung round his neck. "Will you be my wife?" Andrew whispered. "I'll have to think about it," laughed Annie. "Just don't think about it too long. Otherwise the registry office will close and we'll have to postpone it until tomorrow." "Just kidding," Andrew told her. That same day they filed the application. Soon, Annie and Andrew were married. She wanted, of course, a lavish wedding, a romantic trip, but Andrew had no time for all that. They signed, celebrated in an expensive restaurant in a narrow circle of friends. Andrew was working very hard at the time. He understood how precious his time was, so he promised a holiday later, after signing one very big contract. Andrew had his own construction company and had big plans for the future. He constantly expanded his business, tried to introduce new technologies, and took part in projects of international importance. Then he managed to get a large tender, and their standard of living increased significantly. Annie literally bathed in luxury. On her accounts appeared large sums of money, an expensive car, social gatherings. Her life was like a fairy tale. They did not have a romantic trip, and Annie went on holiday with new friends at the institute. Annie entered the paid department, studied by correspondence. Gradually, she got bored with the idle life and wanted something more, something new. Andrew took her to his construction company as an assistant secretary. Her tasks were not difficult: to make copies of documents, send paperwork, remind her of upcoming cases and meetings. Andrew spent most of his working hours at the new site. In the office, his deputy Christopher was in charge of everything. He was in the know, had the right to sign some of the documents, held meetings and small gatherings. They had been working together with Andrew for about 10 years, and Andrew considered him not just an assistant but his right-hand man. So Christopher knew everything about the company. But Andrew did not realize that Christopher was not a friend but an enemy. He was very vain, and he wanted more power than he had then. Although Christopher had joined the company Andrew had already founded before him, he felt that his contribution was enormous and unappreciated by his boss. His ambition was so great that he began to show signs of attention to his boss's young wife. Annie, somewhere deep down, of course, loved her husband, but was still windy and frivolous. She flirted with Christopher and enjoyed it. In her 20s, she certainly lacked attention from her husband, who was always busy. This is what Christopher took advantage of. For him, the relationship with his boss's wife was not just seen as a small victory. For the past 2 years, he had been thinking of ways to frame Andrew or even take his place. And Annie had come in handy in that endeavor. Andrew trusted them both completely and, of course, was unaware that a bond was developing between Annie and Christopher. They had been very careful. Annie had no plans to divorce Andrew. To her, the relationship was nothing more than a mild fling, out of boredom and lack of attention. Christopher, on the other hand, had his own agenda, so they both had a vested interest in making sure no one guessed about the affair. Andrew was so busy with work that even on weekends he could not pay attention to his young wife. His construction was moving at a fairly fast pace, deadlines were tight. All his free time was also spent on work business meetings with potential partners in an informal atmosphere. Annie had fun with her friends and occasionally met Christopher. At first, she was quite happy with this state of affairs, but she still wanted to spend her leisure time with her husband, having fun with him rather than with her friends. Andrew preferred to spend that rare, free from work and meetings in the home. Their interests did not coincide, and the euphoria of the relationship began to gradually decline. Mutual grievances emerged. Andrew got used to care, to order, to the fact that the house is his rear, where there is an atmosphere of love and support. With his ex-wife, he enjoyed moments of family time, dinners with his wife and children together. The very values he was used to had nothing to do with his life with Annie. Annie was raised in a large family, 4 brothers and 2 sisters in all. She was the eldest daughter. She spent her entire childhood and adolescence looking after the younger children. She hardly had a life of her own. It was hard for her mother to be alone with the children, so Annie was always there to help. As a teenager, she wanted to spend time with her friends, not her younger siblings. But her mother rarely let her go out. Their standard of living was below average. The girl did not have good things. Something was bought at sales. Something was given to her by acquaintances and relatives. The youngest children often took things from each other. There was never any tasty food in their house. The children hardly ever saw sweets, and very rarely fruit and meat. The mother never worked. The father worked in a factory as an ordinary turner. Annie never understood why her parents wanted so many children and could not give them a normal life. She was very offended at her mother. Because of her, the girl did not have a normal childhood. Annie finished 9 grades and went to college. After college, she decided to go to New York to study and never return to her parents. She wanted to get a higher education, successfully marry a wealthy man, dress well, visit expensive restaurants and clubs. Actually, she achieved this, but she could not hold on. Relations between Andrew and Annie began to deteriorate. She was interested in entertainment. Andrew wanted the comfort of family. Annie spent a lot of time with her new friends. Andrew was busy with work. Besides, the age difference was also making a difference. Annie was too young and wanted to live her life having fun, at youth parties, not sitting at home in the evenings. She could easily not go to work because she had spent the whole night in a nightclub with her girlfriends. She could drink a lot, which Andrew didn't like very much either. At some point, he realized that this was not the life he had dreamed of. Andrew gradually started talking about children. He missed Cassandra too, but he didn't even know where they were or what was wrong with them. When Andrew announced that he wanted a divorce, Annie was upset, of course, but she didn't stop him. In return, she demanded a portion of the property. The divorce process was very stressful. Annie also insisted on keeping her job. Andrew didn't want her in his company. He planned to divorce and get his wife and children back. It was a beautiful spring day. The early morning sun filled Andrew's room with bright light. It was the day of the divorce. Andrew was looking forward to it, but just before he left the house, his phone rang. "Yes, I'm listening." Andrew picked up the phone. There was a woman's voice on the other end. "Yes, it's me. Who are you? What are you saying?" he asked. "Just a minute. I'll write it down." "Yeah, I got it. Yeah. I'll be there." "Thank you." Andrew was very determined. He didn't turn up for the hearing, didn't say anything to anyone, just drove off somewhere. Annie sat in the court corridor, nervous that Christopher was late. How angry she was when she realized he wasn't coming at all. He didn't answer his phone. He wasn't at home, and he hadn't turned up for work either. Annie was worried. He was still her husband. She should have called the police in case something had happened to him. The police took a report, but there was no hurry to find him. On the 3rd day of his absence, Annie decided to hire a detective. She didn't want to be in the dark. She needed to know where her husband was, what was wrong with him, and why he didn't appear in court. The detective figured out Andrew's whereabouts pretty quickly. Determined to track down her missing husband, Annie traveled to the remote village, and peering through the window of the outermost house by the woods, she was shocked to see her husband there. He looked very happy in the circle of his children. The 2 youngest were sitting on his lap. They were smiling, laughing, hugging their father around his neck. After seeing Andrew at his ex-wife Cassandra's house, Annie decided she wasn't going to leave it like that. She was very angry with him. Her self-esteem had been hurt. She's young, beautiful, almost a goddess. No one could do this to her. In the 2 years Andrew and his family had been apart, they had not lost their love for each other. His heart was breaking with regret. He couldn't forgive himself for doing this to the people closest to him. But Cassandra was a wise woman. She had never said a bad word to the children about their father. Of course, the older ones themselves realized that their daddy had done bad things to them. But when he appeared, they immediately forgave him and were very happy about his return. Unfortunately, Cassandra's ex-wife was very ill and could hardly get out of bed anymore, and her elderly mother could not cope with her grandchildren. The village learned about the situation and tried to do something to help the family. The eldest daughter's teacher found out the number and decided to inform Andrew that his children had been left virtually unattended. He, as soon as he heard, without a moment's hesitation, rushed over to them. Once he got there and finally settled into the long-awaited family atmosphere, he no longer felt like calling anyone or letting anyone know where he was. He switched off the phones. All these days they just talked, hugged, he cried and apologized. Besides, he needed to convince Cassandra to come back to town and get treatment. But she had been in so much pain and distress all this time that she no longer wanted treatment, as she was in a deep depression. Annie went back to town and told Christopher everything. Bastard. He went back to her, you know. I saw them, they'd moved to the middle of nowhere. I don't know how he found them. But if he thinks he can do that to me, he's wrong, Annie complained. But if he could do it to his first wife, why can't he do it to you? Christopher grinned. Because it's me, and it can't happen to me. I'm not going to forgive him or feel sorry for him. I'm willing to help you with whatever you need me to do, but that's fine. You need a quick divorce and he's going to regret it. You help me, and I'll help you. And they decided the time was right to put their plans into action. And Annie, too, was out for revenge. Andrew took Cassandra and the children into town. He had to solve a lot of issues with the placement of the younger child in kindergarten and the older ones in school. He needed to find a nanny for the children and a suitable clinic for Cassandra. At the same time, Andrew had a very important contract for a large sum of money in the pipeline. The lawyers were putting the finishing touches on it. Christopher couldn't sign it. It was out of his area of expertise. A notarized power of attorney was needed to close the deal. Christopher insisted on entrusting him with the contract on the pretext that there were more important issues at the moment, such as the health of his ex-wife. Andrew trusted Christopher unconditionally, so he gave him the opportunity to sign the contract himself. Of course, this was a huge mistake. In fact, he was preparing a fraudulent deal, but no one but Christopher and Annie knew it. According to the contract, the customers invested a huge amount of money, but this money did not get into the company's accounts. Since Christopher was the deputy, no one had any questions for him. He withdrew the money into the accounts of the company, which was owned by a front man. In fact, it looked as if Andrew himself had given such instructions, and only he was responsible for these decisions. The signatures were either his or Christopher's, who was supposedly acting on behalf of the director under a power of attorney and in the interests of the company. Andrew was caught in a trap and had no idea what problems lay ahead. But now he really had other worries. Cassandra, in addition to psychological help, needed surgery. She had had stomach problems before the divorce, but the divorce had aggravated her condition, and for the past 2 months she had struggled to eat anything. She had lost a lot of weight. If Andrew hadn't turned up so timely, their children might have been left motherless. Christopher had already bought a house on the island. He could fly out there at any time with Annie, but there was no need to leave the country at the moment. He had sold his flat in a hurry, and while he was looking for a new place to live, he stayed in a hotel. It was even more convenient that way. No one knew where he was staying. Annie lived in a rented flat, and also put the flat she had inherited from her husband up for sale. Marian returned the car to the salon. The passport was ready. They seemed to have thought of everything and prepared properly. They tried to arrange everything in the company so that, when the truth came out, they would be beyond suspicion. They were prepared to leave the capital in case of emergency. But for now, Christopher continued business as usual. Annie could not defend her position and left the job. However, she fulfilled her function. Thanks to her, Christopher had access to the firm's main account. The withdrawal plan was so well thought out that Christopher was very pleased with himself. The company now had multi-million-dollar obligations to customers that were virtually impossible to fulfill. Andrew was quietly resolving his issues with his family. Cassandra was in hospital, having undergone a rather complicated operation. Ahead of her was a period of rehabilitation, a strict diet, then treatment in a clinic. Andrew had taken care of everything. He found the best doctors and clinic, surrounded Cassandra with care and warmth. His plan was to organize a joint family holiday somewhere by the sea. As soon as Cassandra recovered, they had long intended to spend a longer time together. But Andrew was forever busy until the divorce. But instead of a holiday, he was facing serious problems at work. Andrew, good afternoon. The investor called a week after the contract was signed. Yes, Jonathan, hello. Andrew, is there a problem with the site? I can't see the project. Your assistant hasn't been in touch. Neither have you. Not in the office. I'd like a comment on the situation. Jonathan, aren't you mistaken? We're on a 2-month deadline for the project. So your assistant insisted on shortening the timeline. The funds have been transferred to your company in full. The contract is signed. We've fulfilled our obligations. Is there a problem? I don't want to have to charge you a penalty. But if you don't fulfill your obligations soon, I will be forced to do so. Yes, I'm aware of your family difficulties, and I'm prepared to give you another week's time. Then I will have to take legal action, Jonathan said. I'm sorry, I warned you. I will take care of the situation. I apologize for the delay. Have a good day. Jonathan ended the conversation. Andrew was confused. He had entrusted the contract to Christopher and had certainly not expected any problems. The decision was made to return to the office earlier than planned. He sincerely hoped that there had been some mistake. This contract he had read more than once. According to the terms, they really had 2 months to develop the project. Especially the preliminary version had already been approved by the customer. However, 2 months was the most optimistic term for making the last adjustments, after which they were to start building. Andrew arrived at the office. Christopher was not there. Andrew rushed to look for that contract but couldn't find it. Christopher's phone was switched off. Andrew was beginning to lose patience with all sorts of thoughts popping into his head. The secretary said that Christopher had written an application for a 2-week leave of absence with subsequent dismissal. He'd left it in Andrew's office and assured him it was for business reasons. The bosses know, and signatures and orders are a formality that can be resolved later. Knowing the friendly relationship between Christopher and Andrew, the secretary had no doubts about the authenticity of his words. She accepted the application, authorized it with an incoming number. The lawyers provided a copy of the contract. Andrew reread it again. It was exactly as it had been before he signed it. The terms were 2 months. Since he couldn't find the original, he had to call the customers and ask them to send him their version of the contract. They had been working together for a number of years. In general, their business relationship was already based on trust, so the situation was completely incomprehensible for both parties. Andrew made sure that the original contract did indeed contain the full price, not a prepayment. This was a very large sum of money. Andrew immediately asked the bank for account information. The money was not there. The due date had also been changed from 2 months to a week. Things were looking as unfavorable as possible. Andrew began to realize that Christopher had deceived him. But there were more questions than answers. Why did he do that? What happened between them? After all, he considered Christopher not just a partner, but a friend. Christopher had everything: a high salary, a great office, the ability to make his own decisions. He was the second most important position in the company. Andrew had no other deputies. How could he do this to him? Andrew was confused. He ran through all sorts of thoughts in his head but found no answers to his questions. He needed to find Christopher immediately. He went to his house. The door was closed. No one was there. In fact, Christopher didn't even belong there anymore. He wouldn't have been there. So Andrew went to his parents, but they didn't know where their son was either. He called them a day ago and said he was doing fine. And he's probably pissing and moaning right now, isn't he? Annie grinned, sitting on a sun lounger with an expensive cocktail in her hands. He probably is. All the deadlines are out. I hope he's being charged to the fullest, Christopher replied. I'd like to see it, to look him in the eye, like he did to me. Let him feel it now. I hate the bastard. You'll have that opportunity to look him in the eye. Be patient. The divorce hearing was due in a week. In the meantime, Christopher and Annie decided to take a holiday and flew to Miami. They lay on the beach and imagined how Andrew would have to get out of the situation. Christopher did not realize that it was jealousy that had pushed him to such an act. He sincerely believed that at last justice had been done, and Andrew had got what he deserved, and he would watch what he signed next time. They enjoyed the sea, nature, salty air, and sipped expensive cocktails. Christopher was perfectly happy. He had achieved his goal. Annie was also pleased with herself. She could not forgive Andrew for what he had done. Meanwhile, Andrew was calculating the amount of damages incurred for the company along with the liquidated damages. It was a huge sum. Even if he mortgaged all his property, he would not be able to cover half of the debt. His only option was to sell everything he owned, as well as the controlling interest in the company. But he didn't like that option. It meant that their standard of living would deteriorate significantly. Expensive clinics for his wife, an elite school, a private kindergarten, all of these things required a lot of money. Andrew was desperate. He couldn't lose it all. To begin with, he decided to try to take a loan against the property. He was offered only 1/3 of the amount he needed at a huge interest rate, and he was forced to refuse the bank's offer. It was reckless on such terms. And the amount was not enough. The business community quickly learned that Andrew was in such an unpleasant situation. Some offered to help, others rejoiced at his failures. Yes, Andrew had competitors, of course, and they were hoping that he would lose the company and the niche would open up to other construction organizations. Andrew called an emergency meeting where he honestly announced the situation. He made the decision to sell the company. It had to be done very quickly, otherwise he would also have to pay the legal costs. But to sell a large firm with debt obligations was not so easy. No one could offer him the amount that would suit him. Of course, Andrew was forced to take the extreme step. He didn't want to, but there was no other way out. It was with great difficulty that he made this decision. After negotiations between the customers and Andrew, an agreement was eventually reached. Andrew sells his company and all the property, deposits the money into the investor's account. He pays off the remaining balance within a year. The penalty for non-compliance was very large. Christopher increased it by 30% of the original option in return for 100% payment under the contract. It was a favorable offer for the customers, and they agreed. Christopher purposely changed the contract to drive Andrew into debts that could not be covered by any property. Andrew hastily put all his properties up for sale. The children had to change schools. They took the news quite calmly because it was not the first time. Cassandra had to be taken out of the expensive clinic and moved to the state clinic. It was good that she had already been operated on, and she would have to go through rehabilitation at home. But in fact, they won't even have a home anymore. The week went by quickly. Christopher and Annie returned from their short holiday. Sunburned, rested, revitalized. Andrew hoped he would see Christopher again. Though what could he say to him? Spit in his face, hit him? No words could describe what he had done. He'd done a despicable thing, betrayed a man who thought he was his friend. But he still wanted to see him. Christopher, on the other hand, had no desire to see his boss and decided not to contact him, change his phone number. On the day of the divorce, Annie and Andrew met in the corridor outside the courtroom. They said hello but stood silent for the rest of the day. Annie looked into his eyes and inwardly laughed. Andrew did not know that Annie was also involved in Christopher's machinations. They had resolved all the material, financial issues beforehand. Annie inherited from her husband a large flat, a car, all of which he bought before the marriage. She also had all her jewelry, an annual card of an elite fitness center, and a bank card in her name with a decent amount of money. She was in a better position than Andrew right now. The meeting went pretty quickly. They had no children together, no property disputes either. The judge granted the divorce. The marriage lasted a year and a half. Of that year and a half, only the first year was happy. For the next 6 months, they spent the next 6 months trying to work things out. The property didn't sell out as quickly as Andrew wanted, and investors were waiting. The process really dragged on. Andrew went beyond all deadlines. The customers got tired of waiting and sued. Andrew's lawyers went to court hearings. and tried to negotiate a delay with the customers. But they had already waited a long time, and they wanted their money back as soon as possible. Andrew was still trying to find Christopher, but he was nowhere to be found. Christopher had bought a flat on the other side of town, away from the office and his former residence. It was a modest little flat. It was considered a temporary place to live, and it was inappropriate to draw attention to himself with luxury. He mailed the original contract to the office. Everyone realized that Christopher had set Andrew up, but legally he was clean. He couldn't be held liable. Everything had been worked out. The lawyers were just throwing their hands up in the air. Andrew was trying to realize his assets. He was well aware that now he was completely bankrupt, but he did not feel sorry for himself. He was sorry that all his plans had collapsed at once because of his friend's betrayal. He was sorry that the children wouldn't be able to study in a good place, that Cassandra wouldn't get proper care. Of course, he wasn't going to give up, but in order to build everything back up again, he had to solve the current problems first. And he was solving them. Within a month, he sold his country house, 2 flats, 2 cars, a yacht, transferred the controlling interest to his competitors. According to the court decision, 80% of the debt he had to pay off in one payment, and the rest of the sum was to be transferred within a year. Andrew fulfilled the first part of the judgment. The second part was more difficult. He and his family moved into rented accommodation. He needed a car for mobility and bought a second-hand domestic car. Cassandra began to slowly come round. The stress of the problems had taken its toll on her already difficult psychological state. But now they were together. She, despite everything, continued to love her husband and was ready to go through this difficult journey with him. Cassandra, as before, supported her husband, was a support for him, created a warm psychological environment at home. Andrew appreciated it very much. The older children went to a regular school near the house. The youngest went to kindergarten. Cassandra did not work. Andrew took a job at a firm with a good friend of his father's, knowing the experience he had. He was offered the position of chief engineer. The salary was enough to live on, and he transferred some of it to debt, honoring a court order. Christopher and Annie were very happy. Each of them rejoiced in their own way. Christopher from having huge amounts of money in his accounts, and Annie from the fact that Andrew had lost everything he had. Christopher owned 3 shell companies. He opened them on purpose so that he could later transfer the money he received into their accounts. The lovers' plan was to create 2 new businesses. Christopher wanted to open his own construction firm. Annie dreamed of a beauty salon, but it was too early to think about it. They waited for enough time to pass and passions to settle down, but no one could forbid them to live a life of pleasure. Slowly, they withdrew money from their accounts and spent it on entertainment. They decided that they could afford a holiday and again went to the sea, but now abroad. Annie wanted to go to the Arab Emirates. Christopher couldn't stand the heat, but agreed to go for a week. They packed quickly and were already there the next day. They stayed in a very expensive 5-star hotel. During the day, they slept in an air-conditioned room, visited restaurants and shops, and only in the evening went to the shore of the Persian Gulf. Annie knew that in the Emirates it is forbidden to drink alcohol in public places, as well as being drunk on the street. But she wanted to have so much fun that she poured cocktails into juice cans and sipped them slowly. Besides, this is a very strict Muslim country and women have to dress accordingly. Even female tourists can otherwise be arrested for violating public decency. Annie knew that too. But she was used to the free way of life, and after a good drink, she decided to walk outside the hotel alone. Christopher slept and did not hear Annie leave. In the evening, he woke up and, not finding his companion, reached for his phone. He became very agitated when he saw 18 missed calls from Annie on it. But to call back the phone was no longer online. Going down to reception, he tried to find out where Annie was. He was informed that she had left the hotel grounds almost 4 hours ago. Christopher rushed to look for her. Going round all the shops, restaurants, and beaches in the vicinity of the hotel, he didn't find her. It was getting dark. It was not safe for a girl to be alone in a foreign country at night. Christopher decided it was time to go to the police. He went to the nearest station and tried to explain that his girlfriend was missing. At that moment, there were no employees there who understood Russian. Christopher managed to explain himself through an interpreter on his phone. The police contacted other branches and found out that Annie was in one of them. Christopher was given the address. He called a taxi and went to rescue his companion. The taxi driver turned out to be Russian-speaking. Christopher told him about the situation and asked him to help with the translation at the police station. The taxi driver agreed. Annie had been in the cell for almost 5 hours by this time. At the police station, she had been arrested on a city street after drinking heavily, wearing a short skirt and an open t-shirt. She was behaving defiantly, hooliganizing, singing loudly. Such behavior, especially from a woman, was unacceptable. The police were called. An elderly Arab man filed a report. This meant that they could not just let her go. She was charged with an administrative offense and given a hefty fine. She tried calling Christopher to tell him, but he wouldn't pick up, and her phone was dead. She could have been given a charger, of course, but she was being very naughty at the station, and they just locked her in her cell to sober her up. By the time Christopher arrived, she had more or less recovered. It was quite chilly in the police station, and she was very cold and almost sobered up. Christopher paid a huge fine and was generally very angry with Annie. Late that night, she was released from the station, and they returned to the hotel. All the way, Annie swore at the police, at the Arabs who had turned her in, and generally cursed the country. Christopher tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't calm down. Upon returning to the hotel, Annie continued her concert. Christopher tried to drag her to her room, but her behavior was witnessed by hotel staff and holiday makers. Christopher was beyond angry and decided that they would leave in the morning when Annie woke up. In the morning, Annie felt very ill. She couldn't remember half of last night. Christopher had announced to her his decision to go home, and seeing how resentful he was, Annie didn't argue. In general, her relationship with alcohol was beginning to bother Christopher a great deal. Too often he saw her drunk. It didn't bode well and could become a serious problem. But Annie didn't see it that way. She was convinced that everything was under control. In fact, of course, the problem was already looming. At every event, Annie looked for a place where alcohol was served. Each time, she drank more and more. As time went on, Andrew's family seemed to be stabilizing, but a new trouble came, from a place they weren't expecting. Cassandra received a call from her eldest daughter Marian's school asking her to come over immediately. Cassandra rushed to the principal's office. Her daughter and the juvenile officer were waiting for her. There were more people standing in the corridor waiting for her to arrive. What happened? Oh my God, what have you got there? Cassandra saw the huge bruise on her daughter's face. Mom, I'm fine, her daughter said quietly. What happened? Who beat up my baby? Cassandra raised her voice. Hello, Cassandra. I'm a juvenile detention officer. My name is Mrs. Amanda. There was an unfortunate incident at school today. Your daughter attacked her classmate first, knocking her to the floor. A fight broke out between them. It's all caught on video. You know, modern school children like to film everything on their phones, Mrs. Amanda continued. They tried to separate them, but before they could injure each other, your daughter broke the other girl's nose and tore her clothes. But what happened? She didn't just sit there and decide to attack. It doesn't happen that way. She was provoked. Cassandra hugged her daughter and tried to see the bruise. Cassandra, of course, will look into it. We'll talk to the other students. But right now we have a report from the injured girl's mother about the injury. They'll go to the trauma center, have the bruises removed, and will be forced to put your daughter on the register. A battery? My daughter doesn't have a beating? Do you see what's on her face? Cassandra was outraged. Where were the teachers during this time? Why are the children in this school left to their own devices? We'll take the beating down too, and we'll file a counterclaim too. My daughter has never fought with anyone. She's an honors student. She's always had perfect behavior. She must have been provoked, especially since they were standing there with cameras filming, so they were expecting her to do something. The inspector invited the second girl and her mom into the headmaster's office. Accusations poured in against Cassandra's daughter. The mom was shouting at the whole office. The whole floor could hear her. Cassandra was an intelligent woman and could not afford to speak in such a manner. She listened to the monologue and replied in a calm voice. We'll see whose daughter is a criminal. Submit your application. We'll deal with it. I have nothing more to say to you. Mom and daughter left the office. Cassandra and her daughter stayed behind. "We'll go to the hospital now, we'll fix the injuries," said Cassandra. "I will find out more about the girl, and the incident will be made public, and let the proper authorities deal with it. I suspect there's a lot of lawlessness going on in your school, and no one cares," she said to the headmaster. "Oh, those teenagers. I don't know what's in their heads." The headmistress got worried. She didn't need any more inspections at the beginning of the school year. She tried to soften Cassandra's anger. "You know, they're just kids, but they think they're very mature. We will, of course, deal with the situation internally. There's no need to involve outsiders. It's going to have a negative impact on our children's studies. The girl is the leader of the class. They must have had a disagreement with your daughter." "No, of course not," Cassandra replied. "Fighting is a totally unacceptable way of solving problems, but I'm sure it was unintentional and won't happen again." Cassandra didn't want to continue this conversation. She said she had to go, and she and her daughter went home. They had a very important conversation to have. If the child was really hurt, humiliated, teased, then she should not go on studying in this school. Marian did not want to tell what had happened for a long time, but Cassandra managed to find out. From the first day in this school, the girl was disliked. The class was formed by companies. Marian didn't fit in anywhere, and the neighborhood where the family now lived and where the school was located was not the most prosperous. Many of the children were completely devoid of any kind of upbringing. Some parents didn't take much interest in their children's lives at all. Marian was from such a family. She lived in a single-parent family with her mother and brother. Her mother had to work hard to support her 2 children, but even on weekends she didn't pay attention to them. She had other interests. At times she drank alcohol. It was her relaxation and a way to relieve stress. Her daughter lived on her own, did poorly in school, bullied kids from the lower grades. This time it was Cassandra's daughter who was the victim of her bullying. Marian came to school well-dressed. She had expensive clothes, a nice backpack. Everyone immediately realized that she didn't come from an ordinary family. At first they started to extort small amounts of money from her. Marian didn't agree, didn't give anything back. One day when the class was in the hall for gym class, this girl and 2 of her friends came back to the classroom, got into Marian's backpack and took all the money out of it. Marian noticed it was missing and realized who had done it, but she couldn't prove it. So they thought they were getting away with it, and next time they cut her backpack with scissors. Marian tried to talk and even threatened to tell the principal everything, but it didn't lead to anything good. The offending girl snatched the phone out of Marian's hands, got into it, took caricature pictures of Marian's family members' faces and sent them to her classmates. The whole class laughed, of course, but the last straw was when the classmates started commenting on the pictures, ridiculing and saying all sorts of unpleasant things about Marian's parents. That's when Marian couldn't take it anymore and ran up to the offending girl. At that very second, a fight broke out between the girls. Everyone was already standing around filming the fight on their phones. The children were amused to watch what was happening. They were laughing and commenting. Then the teacher came in and asked for help to separate the girls. The principal was invited, and then the juvenile inspector. Cassandra realized from the beginning that her daughter could not have attacked a classmate for no reason. The situation was discussed in the family circle, and a decision was made. 2 days later, Cassandra came to school again. She had 2 applications in her hand. She was withdrawing both her daughters from this school. She had also made inquiries and found out that the second girl had been involved in similar incidents more than once. So if the girl's mom presses her case, Cassandra will go to the prosecutor's office. Then the school would be in big trouble. Of course, it had to be followed through. But Cassandra didn't have the time or energy for that. Marian and her little sister went to another school. It was further away from home, but Cassandra found no bad reviews about it. This whole story was very deeply felt by Andrew. He felt guilty that he had failed to protect his family, his daughter, that he had allowed such a change in his life in the first place. Andrew decided that he was treading water. The results he was already getting were not enough. So he started looking for additional work in order to get closer to buying a flat and to be able to return his children to their old school. Education, a lot of work experience, and a desire to develop further were Andrew's indispensable qualities. He was not only a good manager, but also an executive subordinate. The management considered Andrew an excellent specialist, one of the best in his field. But Andrew wanted more. He was looking for a remote job. Quite quickly, he was offered the option to become a consultant on project activities. He could in his free time analyze and make his own judgments on project declarations in private companies. He took a very thorough approach to his work, emphasizing each stage of a construction project. He was known in construction circles and was sought out for consultation. This brought Andrew additional income. Cassandra also decided to get a job. She had a degree in biochemistry. She could have been an ecologist, but she had never worked in her specialty. Immediately after the institute, she was offered a job as a human resources specialist. She took the training and since then worked only in this sphere. After the birth of her third child, it became clear that she could not physically go to work after maternity leave. And there was no need at the time. Andrew was earning well. Cassandra was free to take care of the children in the house. And after the divorce, Cassandra had worked for a small company for a while until she moved to the country. Now she was looking for a job that would allow her to take occasional time off to attend her children's clinics, school and kindergarten parent-teacher conferences, or to work part-time. It was not easy to find such a job, but she was hired for 4 hours a day at a private medical company. Cassandra was comfortable there, a good young team, new pleasant acquaintances, variety in her life. At this time, Christopher and Annie decided that enough time had passed and it was possible to come out of the shadows, but it was dangerous to start their business in New York. Andrew would be on to them very quickly, so they thought that Los Angeles would be the city, even though it was more than half the size of New York. But there was little chance of finding them there. It was decided that they would move. Christopher bought himself a flat in downtown Los Angeles. He and Annie planned to live there alone. The flat was not a temporary home, so Christopher had spared no expense in buying it. It was a luxurious duplex flat with a good modern renovation. The flat had 4 rooms, 2 bathrooms on each floor, and a huge kitchen living room. There was a heated gated car park under the house. They bought a space for 2 cars. Within a week, they were fully settled in, moving all their belongings. The space next to the house was perfectly organized. There was a recreational area like a small park, a small fitness club, and many different small shops. Now it was up to them to find a place for the business. Annie didn't want and didn't know how to organize everything, so she was looking for a ready-made solution. She was not just interested in a beauty salon, but a salon with the widest possible range of services. She started looking for such an option. Such a place was found. It was quite far from where she lived, but it met all her requirements. The salon belonged to the wife of a big businessman from Seattle. They were leaving the country and selling off all their property. The cost of the salon was quite high, but Annie wasn't worried about the money. She had helped Christopher, and he had promised her to buy the salon in return. So it was decided to settle on this place. The salon really did include a full range of services. It had everything from a sauna to a manicure room. All the staff had been carefully selected by the previous owners, and Annie wasn't going to look for new ones. There was an administrator who ran the whole place. She knew her job very well. Annie was very pleased with her work. The only thing she wanted to change was the name of the salon and some interior decorating. It took just under a month. The longest thing she thought about was what to call her salon. In the end, she came up with nothing and named it after herself, Annie's Beauty Salon. Annie loved it. It seemed like her dreams were coming true. Christopher and his construction company had a much harder time. He did not want to take a ready-made business, but always dreamed of opening it from scratch, especially since the funds now allowed him to do it. It was very difficult to find the right premises. He traveled all over Seattle. He didn't like everything. Finally, he found the right one. The space was suitable for an office. He bought it and started renovating. At the same time, he hired lawyers who were engaged in opening the company and tax registration. When the renovation was almost complete, Christopher contacted a recruitment agency. He needed to find a lot of people for his firm. As a result, he had quite a large staff, both office workers and personal construction crews. What remained was to find a good architect. All of this took him several months. But Christopher was very pleased with himself. He had fulfilled a dream. He had created his own construction company. There was no grand opening. Christopher didn't want to draw attention to himself. Once the office was up and running, he needed to find customers and contractors. To Seattle circles, he was an unknown face. To somehow attract investors, he offered good discounts. Slowly, customers with smaller projects started to come in. For a young, unknown firm, it was a huge success. Christopher immersed himself in his work. He enjoyed his business. Annie was hardly involved in the affairs of her salon. She did not understand anything about it and came there more often for cosmetic services. The salon had a lot of clients, almost all of whom were regulars. Only well-to-do ladies could use the services of the salon. The cost of procedures was high, but the quality of services was at the highest level. Business was booming. The administrator reported weekly to Annie about the work done. Several months flew by. Christopher's company was also slowly but surely growing. The number of sites was growing. They were getting larger and were already generating income. Christopher got acquainted with a huge number of new useful people, became better known in his circles. None of them even guessed what funds his firm was created on. Everything was going great until one fine day, when a former business partner appeared on the doorstep of his office. "Christopher, is that you?" I thought I recognized the name. "Good afternoon, Sebastian." "You're right. It's me. Good to see you. What are you doing in Seattle?" "Oh, I'm here on mostly personal business. I heard a new company opened up, created some competition. I wanted to see who's working against their own profit margins. Who can afford it?" "You're wrong, Sebastian. My company makes me money." "Are you aware of the rumors about you? Is it true you screwed your boss out of a lot of money? He's been looking for you, by the way." "Yeah, I know, and I hate to hear it. That's why Andrew and I parted ways. That's not true. It was his fault, and he blamed it on me." Christopher tried to justify himself. I don't know. Maybe we could have lunch together. You can tell me all about what they're saying about me. There's a nice little restaurant around the corner." "Thank you, Christopher. But I gotta go. I just came by to make sure it was you." "Well, when you're in LA, drop by. Have a good day, Sebastian." They said goodbye. Christopher held himself together, but inside he was shaking. He hadn't expected to see someone from his old neighborhood here. This meeting had not been a coincidence. Andrew's visit was now to be expected. From that day on, he was constantly thinking about how to behave when he met his former boss and friend. His neurosis was growing and life no longer seemed so marvelous. Christopher, of course, calmed himself with the fact that it was almost impossible to prove his involvement in the scam. But to face his former friend was not a pleasant prospect. When he got home that evening, he wanted to tell Annie. She was home, but she was going somewhere in a hurry. "Annie, where are you going?" "Oh, Christopher, why are you home so early?" "I asked you a question." "I don't know. Have you been drinking?" "No, I had a few drinks to get me in the mood. We're having a party at the salon for the accountant's birthday. Can I go to the accountant's birthday party?" Annie was having trouble pronouncing the words. She wasn't just drunk, she was pretty drunk. "Where are you going in your condition? Take your clothes off, you're not going anywhere like that." Christopher was angry. He was upset enough as it was, and now Annie was being weird. "I'll go." Annie wouldn't calm down. "No, you're not." Christopher grabbed her arm and dragged her into the bathroom. He turned on the shower and threw water on her from head to toe. "Are you crazy or something? What did you do?" "You've ruined my makeup," Annie shouted. "Go to bed. We'll talk tomorrow," Christopher said as he helped her wash the paint off her face and change into her clothes. It had been a long night, and he couldn't forget the encounter. Thousands of thoughts were running through his head. When he arrived in New York, Sebastian called Andrew and told him about his meeting with Christopher. Andrew himself had assumed that Christopher would start investing his money in some business. Of course, he wanted to see Christopher, to look him in the eye. But he needed to prepare himself mentally. Too much time had passed since their last meeting. Andrew's life was slowly getting better. He'd almost paid off all his debts to the investors. The next step was to buy his own place. A small flat, but his own. He was going to take out a loan and was already looking at suitable options. Cassandra was helping him. Her income was small, but even this contribution was very important. They were starting from scratch again, just like when they were young. It only made their relationship stronger. In the evenings, they would sit down, open the internet and look at different options for flats. In their free time, they would go to look at them. They wanted a neighborhood where there was a school for older children. Housing there was quite expensive, but Andrew had a goal, and he was going for it. Annie began spending evenings out of the house more and more often. Each time she came in smelling of alcohol. She always found someone to have fun with. Annie dropped out of college and the nightclubs and restaurants started again. Not a single event was without alcohol. Gradually, everything came to the point that Annie started drinking almost every day, including in the morning. She didn't see it as a problem. Christopher, on the other hand, was stressed by her condition. He tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen. They fought a lot. Christopher threatened to put her in a clinic. One day, as he drove up to the house, he saw Annie's car parked next to a parked car. It was parked in the neighboring driveway. Annie was asleep inside. That was the last straw. Christopher found out that she'd been driving under the influence of alcohol. She'd never done that before. If she drank, she'd call a taxi. He was terribly angry. Took her out of the car and carried her home. She drove herself home, but she couldn't get into the car park, so she stood in the driveway. It was useless to talk to her in that state, so he put her to bed. In the morning, he informed his assistant that he would not be coming to work. Christopher called several alcohol treatment clinics and arranged to bring Annie to them. Annie woke up with a terrible headache. Christopher lied to her that he wanted to take her to the clinic, do the procedure, and bring her home. During the night, he packed up some of her belongings and carried them into the boot of the car. Annie agreed. She showered, dressed, and they drove. She'd had a lot of motion sickness on the road, so she was glad she was going to get some help now and feel better. When she saw the sign on the building, she asked again, how long would they be here for? Christopher confirmed his earlier words. Just a procedure, and then home. But at the clinic, she was immediately placed in a private room with bars and put on a drip. She got much better. Christopher, meanwhile, was contracting for the treatment. When Annie decided it was time for her to go home, Christopher and the head doctor came into the room. They informed her that the course of treatment would be 3 months. From there, they would see how she fared. Of course, it was not in her plans to spend 3 months of her life in the clinic. She started arguing, screaming, demanding to be let out. But Christopher left without her. She stayed in a locked ward with bars. She felt deceived, betrayed, the most miserable person in the world. She didn't realize Christopher really wanted to help her. Actually, her stay at the clinic wasn't so bad. She was well fed, had a laptop and internet. She was allowed to walk around the clinic grounds with an escort. Annie slept a lot, took walks, and ate properly. Her general condition and complexion improved. Her analyses came back normal. She was bored without her friends, without Christopher. Every day was similar to the previous one. But gradually she began to realize that this was a forced measure, that she had really gone down the wrong path. And Annie promised herself that when she left the clinic, she wouldn't drink any more alcohol. Andrew thought long and hard about whether he should go out with Christopher. What would it bring him? And finally he decided he wouldn't do it for the time being. Christopher waited for him to come to his company every day and was worried. But it wasn't Andrew's arrival that got him into trouble. The IRS found Christopher's account with a large sum of money. It was a bank in Chicago, and the IRS requested all movements on the account. The bank couldn't refuse and provided a statement. This money was transferred from a foreign account, of which Christopher is also the owner. With such transfers, the tax authorities have questions about where the money came from and whether it was legally received. Christopher's other accounts were also checked. In addition, the question arose as to where the funds to start a construction organization came from. This was a huge blunder on Christopher's part. He transferred all the money to his different accounts in different banks. This was necessary to set up the firm. Most of the money went into organizing the company. But with the rest, he planned to build a country house. The tax machine started. It was unstoppable. Christopher was summoned for clarification and given the opportunity to collect documents confirming the legality of receiving the money within a certain period of time. A small portion of it he could show. There was an opportunity to procrastinate while he worked with Andrew, but the main part, of course, was obtained illegally. His organization had also been audited. A solution was urgently needed. There was no solution. The accounts were blocked until he reported on them. If they started digging deeper, he faced a real prison sentence. Christopher didn't have much cash. What was left was the property he'd bought Annie. All of it had to be sold immediately and out of the country. But Annie was in the clinic, she was still undergoing treatment. Christopher decided to pick her up early, because without her personal presence he could not even draw up a power of attorney with a notary for the sale of the property. Time was short. On the way home, Christopher explained the problems he was having, and that the same problems awaited Annie if she suddenly refused to leave the country. And she was sorry to leave her salon, especially now that she was about to start a new life. But there was nowhere to go. They put all of Annie's possessions up for sale to make some money. It was all sold at a reduced price. The salon was practically half price. Annie didn't explain anything to her employees. She just told the receptionist she had to leave immediately. Within a week, everything she owned was sold. The money was put into her foreign account, some of it taken in cash. They were ready to fly to Hawaii. They had the airbag. But because Christopher didn't report his accounts and firm on time, the IRS started looking for him. At the same time, in the process of finding out all the movements of funds, the IRS found Andrew's former firm, and then Andrew himself. He provided all the contracts under which the investors' money was transferred. Andrew was asked to write a statement, and he became the main figure in the case. His testimony later in court became decisive. The club began to be examined. The story became more and more interesting. Law enforcement agencies also got involved with the tax authorities. Now Christopher would no longer be limited to a fine. Much more serious consequences awaited him. We were talking about a very large sum of money, so the law enforcement authorities acted very quickly. They realized that Christopher now had only one way to flee the country. Police officers were posted at all railway stations and airports to apprehend him. They couldn't let him get away. When Christopher and Annie traveled to the airport, they did not yet know that they, or rather only Christopher, were already wanted. As they were checking in for their flight, airport officials approached them and asked them to come with them for identification. Christopher realized they were trapped. He grabbed Annie's hand and tried to run away. But they were intercepted by police officers on the way out. Christopher and Annie ended up at the police station. The process of clarifying all the circumstances of the case took a little less than a month. All this time, Christopher and Annie sat in a detention cell. There were questions about Annie, too. She, while working at Andrew's firm, had taken advantage of her position and passed on confidential data. She was an accessory to a crime. Andrew didn't know about her connection to Christopher, and when he did, it was only then that he realized what a terrible person she was and how long she had been deceiving him. There were no barriers for her. She was willing to go head-to-head to achieve her goal. How deluded had Andrew been when he succumbed to her influence? How much of his life changed with her arrival? How had he made his near and dear ones suffer? There were several court hearings. Christopher's lawyer, provided to him by the state, failed to defend him. The investors who transferred the money under the contract, the organization's lawyers, and other employees of Andrew's former company were brought to the meeting as witnesses. They all gave the same testimony. That transaction was found to be fraudulent. As a result of the audit, Christopher faced several articles: embezzlement of funds on a large scale, illegal entrepreneurial activity, non-payment of taxes. Annie was tried as an accomplice, but then she was reclassified as a witness. Annie testified, told the whole scheme, according to which Christopher acted. She was not tried, but all the money in her accounts was blocked because it was illegally obtained. Christopher was sentenced to 6 years in prison with confiscation of property. Also, all monies were blocked. Then in court, Andrew had the opportunity to look into the eyes of his former friend. He didn't even have to say anything, everything was too well read in his eyes. Andrew had never imagined that life would present him with such a gift that he would be able to get what was his and Christopher would be punished. There was no regret or remorse on Christopher's part. He had so cynically ruined Andrew's family's life, yet he continued to believe he was doing the right thing. Annie, having burst into Andrew's family like a hurricane one day, had swept away all the beautiful things in his life. She had used him as much as she could and betrayed him too. Andrew thought he was a good judge of character, but it turned out he wasn't. Now Andrew had to get his money back. It wasn't a quick process. First there was an investigation, then several court hearings. All the while the money was sitting in Christopher and Annie's accounts. The story was complicated. In fact, the money had to go back into the accounts of a construction organization that Andrew no longer owned. The lawyers had a long and painstaking job ahead of them to reconstruct the whole chain. Almost everything that belonged to Christopher and Annie was purchased with the stolen money. This fact had been proven. Christopher could not confirm the legal appearance of the money. Finally, all the money was returned to Andrew's account, except for a small amount, which Andrew had not had time to return to the investors. This money was also returned to them from Christopher's account. It was the beginning of a new life. Andrew no longer had any debts or liabilities and owned very large sums of money. The first thing Andrew decided to do was to get his firm back on track. He had started it from scratch, and a lot of effort had been put into it. But the new founders were not eager to sell it back. Andrew had to offer almost twice as much for it as when he sold it. It was a bargain, and Andrew got his firm back. Things didn't work out so well for the new owners, so the business was unprofitable at first. But that didn't matter. Andrew got the company back on track. His old customers came back to him, and business picked up. Andrew and Cassandra decided not to return their first house. There were too many different, not very pleasant memories associated with it. They decided to build a new home, and Andrew set about it. He set himself a very tight deadline, so much so that he wanted to be in his own home sooner. He had to give up his job as chief engineer. Cassandra didn't quit. She loved her job. The children were moved to the old garden and school. The house was built quickly, and the whole family participated in the design of the house. They also chose finishing materials and designed together to create the perfect space for living there. The house turned out to be big, spacious, and very cozy. This family had to go through a lot of unpleasant moments, but they managed to survive it all, and from this they became only closer to each other. What happened to Annie? All the money from her accounts was seized and given to Andrew. She didn't have a flat or a car. She pawned all her jewelry. It should have been enough money to rent a flat and find a job. She also decided to re-enroll at the institute. It was not easy. She had to pay off debts from several sessions. But since Annie was given a second chance, she had to take it. She returned to her first job at the Museum of Art, also as an assistant museum curator. That position was still available. All the while she had to pay for tuition, rented accommodation, and somehow live. The salary was woefully inadequate, and Annie realized that she couldn't do it all on her own. She had to look for another job or leave the institute in search of a new job. She came across an advert that offered young and beautiful girls a job as a masseur in a very expensive massage parlor. Since Annie had no education and did not know much about anything, she decided to find out what kind of work it was. The director of the establishment liked her very much. You don't meet such really beautiful girls very often. And I was offered to take Thai massage courses and was offered 2 options for earning money: massage to male and female clients without providing intimate services, or massage to male clients, which included intimate services. The difference in pay was substantial. But Annie wasn't ready for the second option. She was hired. First, she had to go through 3 weeks of training. This included not only training in Thai body massage itself, but also in aromatherapy. The training was very interesting and useful. Annie learned a lot about the basic massage techniques, relaxing and sports massage. During the training, the girls gave massages to each other. It turned out to be very pleasant. Annie liked everything. She had different clients coming to her. She took both men and women. The pay was decent. It allowed her to pay her tuition. She felt like her life was finally getting better. Andrew finished building a house, and he and his family moved in. He continued to work and develop his firm, expanding the company's ability to provide construction services. He also paid a lot of attention to the development of his employees. They regularly underwent various trainings. Trainings were organized for them. All this motivated them to grow professionally. On the anniversary since his return to the company, he decided to gather everyone and hold a banquet. The event was organized in one of the restaurants. Everything went at the highest level: a posh table, live music, a pleasant atmosphere. But apart from the banquet, Andrew gave all the employees certificates for visiting a Thai massage parlor. He decided that it was time for him to relax too, and he and Cassandra came to the place where Annie worked. The receptionist met them and ushered them into a relaxing room. The candles were already burning there, the scent beginning to dissipate into the air. Andrew and Cassandra lay down on the couches opposite each other. Two beautiful girls came out to join them. They were supposed to be giving massages. One of them was Annie. She saw Andrew lying in front of her and silently ran out of the room. The receptionist told her to go back and do her job, but Annie didn't agree. She was ashamed to go back. She didn't want to be recognized. She could be fired for that. Bookings were tight. There were no masseuses available. The salon could lose a loyal customer. Annie was faced with a choice: lose her job or suffer humiliation. So she went back into the room. But when Andrew recognized her, he refused her services. He and Cassandra left and never went to the salon again. The story reminded them of everything they had been through. Annie had never experienced such humiliation before, but it was also good for her to remember everything so that she would not repeat her mistakes in the future. Christopher was the only one who spent his days in the cell. He had plenty of time to analyze his life, only he never realized his mistakes. Seeing a little girl singing at the fountain, the widower hurried to give her some change, and noticing the bracelet on her hand, Adrien slowly walked down the main street of the city. Recently, the office of the company, where the man had been working as an engineer for almost 15 years, had moved to a new building. On the one hand, it was harder to get to work farther from home, plus traffic jams in the mornings and evenings. On the other hand, the building itself was beautiful and bright, and the cityscape around it was pleasing to the eye. Smart people, squares, fountains, picturesque parks, the center of the city, after all. Adrien had recently made it a rule not to rush immediately after the end of the working day to the parking lot, but to walk for a while in the streets. It was a kind of relaxation. Every day here felt like a holiday. Children with balloons and ice cream, horses drawn in carriages. By the time you drove back and forth, there would be no evening traffic, and you could get into the car and go home. Since Stacy had moved in with Adrien, coming home had been much more pleasant. The apartment smelled different now: fresh baked goods, delicious home-cooked food, feminine perfumes and creams. Cozy, cozy, cozy smells. And Stacy herself was cozy, warm, kind. Adrien's heart gradually thawed beside her. He'd been through a lot. Not everyone has to go through what happened to Adrien's family. The man thought he was no longer capable of strong feelings. But Stacy, she was a real revelation to him. It turns out there could be joy in his life. Quiet, so calm, so peaceful, watching TV shows together in the evening, going on picnics with friends, traveling to the sea in the velvet season. And yet the heavy thoughts did not let Adrien go until the end. There was a feeling of understatement, uncertainty. And how could it be otherwise, when it was still unknown what had happened to Amelie? Young parents with young children, especially girls of 4 or 5, still caught Adrien's eye. Right now he was looking at a family walking just ahead of him. A young, slender mom. The father of the family in a brightly colored print t-shirt and jean shorts. 2 children, a boy about 8 years old and a 4-year-old toddler. The boy walked with an impassive, bored look. Perhaps he didn't want to go for a walk with his family. The girl, on the other hand, she looked around with curious eyes and asked questions. The parents, Adrien could clearly see, were a little tired of their youngest daughter's sociability. The mother answered one-word answers. The father, in general, several times irritably asked the child to be quiet. Oh, young people. They do not understand what happiness it is to walk with a little daughter by the hand, to talk to her. Adrien would now gladly answer a million questions of a 4-year-old girl. Not for nothing they say what we have do not keep. But why not keep it? Years ago, Adrien quite consciously enjoyed fatherhood. His daughter Amelie never annoyed him like this young father, nor did she tire him like her mother, who walked with an unhappy face slightly away from him. Perhaps it was because he and Tiana had waited so long for this child. Adrien and Tiana had met at the institute, studying related engineering specialties. They shared many of the same lectures. Adrien immediately noticed the pretty, quiet student with the big blue eyes. It wasn't surprising there weren't many girls in their department. And yet Tiana stood out from the rest. Blonde, wavy hair, wide open eyes, straight features. But Adrien wasn't just attracted by her good looks. Unlike the other girls, Tiana didn't make eyes at guys. She was genuinely interested in the subject, just as Adrien was. And young men who tried to get involved with her were sharply rejected. Adrien took a chance one day. He was paired with Tiana. They were to work on a project together. Well, it was that work that brought them together. They became a very cohesive team, and that's how they became a friendship, which later grew into something more. Tiana and Adrien had a lot in common. They grew up in roughly the same families and were into the same things. Even their plans for life were similar in many ways. Both wanted to first build careers, to achieve something, to find their place, and then to have offspring. The young people got married and rented an apartment. Tiana got a job in a laboratory at the Research Institute, continued her scientific work. Adrien chose to practice and went to the engineering department at the factory. At first, both received literally pennies. Then the spouses began to grow in their careers. Income increased. Soon they were able to buy their own apartment and make repairs in it. The newlyweds lived soul to soul. Adrien was so easy, so pleasant next to Tiana. She understood him with half a word, and he, accordingly, also understood her. There were no loud arguments and quarrels between them. All matters were settled by negotiation and discussion of facts and opinions. His mother often told Adrien that no girl would get along with him, so pedantic and correct. She was wrong. Tiana was as rational and conscientious as he was. It turned out that they had found each other. Adrien was happy. Everything in his life was working out even better than he had ever dreamed. The couple tried to take vacation days. Together they liked to travel around Russia. They went to Altai and Karelia and climbed mountains and admired Baikal. It was so great to get acquainted with all this splendor together with the same enthusiastic and delighted wife. 7 years had passed since the wedding. When Adrien and Tiana started talking about children, the material base for future heirs was prepared. Grandmothers on both sides have long been waiting for grandchildren and vowed to look after the kids. And with great pleasure. Accordingly, Tiana would not have to sacrifice her career at the Research Institute. And the couple themselves already wanted children. Adrien imagined how he would introduce his son or daughter to the world, tell this little man about everything. And Tiana would make a wonderful mother. She is so attentive, so sensitive, so wise. The couple consciously decided to approach the issue of childbearing. First, they were fully examined to reduce the chances of an unhealthy baby. That's when it became clear that Tiana had female problems. Very serious ones. Pregnancy is practically impossible, said the verdict of the doctor, Professor Ivanov, to whom Tiana with such difficulty managed to make an appointment. What, no chance at all, Adrien clarified. He had accompanied his spouse to the clinic that day. But it is possible to try different treatment options, the doctor replied evasively. Only all these methods are expensive and time-consuming, and I can't guarantee the result. Congenital anomalies of development. It happens, unfortunately. This was a blow to the couple. Until now, they had everything worked out, everything went according to plan. And then all of a sudden this happened. And even after the professor's disappointing verdict. Both Adrien and Tiana suddenly realized how much they wanted to be parents. And so began a period of treatment. Wandering around doctors, taking endless tests, Tiana's periodic hospitalizations. All this took a lot of money and time and, most importantly, moral strength. It was very hard at first to hope, to fulfill all doctors' prescriptions, and then to be disappointed time after time. Always calm, rational Tiana now often cried when she thought that her husband did not see. But he noticed everything: her red eyes and puffy eyelids. And worst of all, the desperate look of pain in her eyes. It was hard for Adrien to see his wife like that. His main desire now was not a child, but the peace and happiness of the woman he loved. But how to help Tiana? Adrien did not know the answer to this question. The man, as he could, supported his wife, sought for her consultations in the best reproductive centers in the country, went with her to painful procedures, calmed her down. Maybe we should give up this idea, he sometimes suggested. The race to have a baby has already taken on a kind of unhealthy character. I feel like stopping it. Let's develop our careers. That's important too, isn't it? Once upon a time, work, academia, that was the main thing in Tiana's life. The woman's eyes lit up when she talked about a new development or experimental project. Work inspired Tiana, gave her strength and energy, and she was good at what she did, very good. She was respected, she was invited to consultations, she was approached with difficult questions. Adrien was happy for his wife and proud of her. He understood Tiana. The man himself gave a lot of time and effort to the plant and was also considered a first-class specialist, but the spouses acted in slightly different fields. Now Tiana had changed a lot. She no longer took on interesting projects. served in the laboratory from call to call, and hurried home. The once prominent scientist now preferred simple chores and had completely abandoned her research. This truly frightened Adrien. He understood, of course, that the female body is organized differently than the male. The female sex is more susceptible to the influence of hormones. The maternal instinct is a great power and all that. But still, the changes that were happening to Tiana were alarming. She had become lethargic, irritable, even somewhat cranky. This once pleasant woman was fixated on this most inaccessible motherhood, made the child as an idea fix, and nothing else interested her. Nothing else pleased and fascinated her. She even stopped communicating with her friends and colleagues. Tiana devoted all her free time to studying information about her diagnosis. Several long years passed. During this period, Tiana calmed down and returned to work for a while. But the dream of becoming a mother did not let her go until the end, and sooner or later everything resumed: trips to doctors, tests, research. Medicine does not stand still. New reproductive technologies appear. Old ones are being improved. You have to try was how Tiana explained her behavior to her husband. Adrien missed the old Tiana, smart, purposeful, understanding. Sometimes she came back for a while, and it was a real happiness. They talked about different topics again, watched movies together, planned trips. Why don't we take the baby out of the orphanage? With this proposal, Adrien addressed his wife more than once. He thought that a child, even if it was not his own, would make Tiana happy, help her finally feel like a mother. But she, Tiana, needed only her child, and she went to her goal, not noticing nothing and no one around. After about 15 years of marriage, the long-awaited pregnancy finally happened. Another experimental treatment helped. Adrien and Tiana were almost 40 years old at the time. The man did not expect such a result. The news came as a surprise to him and even frightened him a little, knocked him out of his rut. So many years to live with his wife, only the two of them. And here. But Tiana was happy without any reservations. Despite the wild nausea, because of which the woman could not eat at all in the first months, despite the constant pain in the abdomen and lower back, despite the dizziness, Tiana tolerated pregnancy badly. She almost never left the hospital, constantly lying under some drips, drank handfuls of medicines, endured painful injections. Several times there was a threat of miscarriage. Adrien could not imagine what would have happened to Tiana if. But the doctors managed to keep the complicated pregnancy going, because Tiana was under special supervision. To be honest, Adrien had no warm feelings for the future child. He saw it as a problem, as an obstacle that prevented his wife from living a normal, full life. And then Amélie was born, and Adrien was the first to hold that tiny, wrinkled red creature in his arms. Tiana insisted that her husband attend the birth with her. It's such an event, long awaited and huge, she said. So many problems and trials are behind us. And here it is, the prize. Besides, the doctors say that we will definitely not have more children. So, Adrien didn't want to be in the delivery room, and he was intimidated by the process. And he had no reverence for the whole thing, but he had to. At the moment when Adrien first looked at the face of his newborn daughter, the man suddenly felt that the world for him turned upside down, became completely different. The baby screamed loudly, making everyone aware of the expressive changes that had happened to her. And the man realized that his girl was cold, terribly hurt. He felt it in his gut. Adrien pressed his daughter to him, gently rocked her in his arms. The girl sobbed, looked at him a couple more times and calmed down. She felt safe around her father. Adrien realized that the daughter is now the closest, dearest person to him, that he, for her sake, he would roll mountains and get the moon from the sky. Then the child was given to her mother. The girl had to be fed, and Adrien was asked to leave the room. "I'll see you at the discharge," the midwife smiled. Now the mother and the baby needed some time alone. Adrien and Tiana were wonderful parents. They could spend hours just admiring their little Amélie. They were fascinated by everything about her, and how she tried to reach for a toy, and how she jumped with her hands and feet, and how the first smile appeared, the first tooth, the first tentative steps. It was all becoming a huge event for the new parents. Adrien had to leave for work every morning. Tiana stayed with Amélie. She completely dissolved in motherhood. The woman had waited so long for this. Tiana practiced a lot with Amélie, gave her massages, cooked delicious baby food for her, and took her for walks. With her usual zeal, Tiana studied the literature on the development of young children and practiced her new knowledge on her own child. In many ways, Amelie learned new skills faster than her peers. She spoke early. She learned to draw, sculpt, and button early. Adrien and Tiana couldn't get enough of their daughter. She was such a clever girl, such a beauty. Outwardly, Amelie resembled Adrien's grandmother: thick, dark hair, huge brown eyes, dark skin. Nothing of me, the blonde-haired, fair-skinned Tiana marveled. Nothing surprising, Adrien joked. They say dark genes are stronger. That's fine. But what a bright girl she's growing up to be. Black eyebrows, long, dark eyelashes. She won't even have to wear makeup. She'll save on cosmetics. Amelie grew up an affectionate, obedient girl and very inquisitive. The child inherited a passion for exploring the world from both parents. Tiana was very worried about this peculiarity of her daughter. Amelie climbed everywhere. She was interested in what is on the top shelves of the closet, how the alarm clock is organized, how deep the puddles. She climbed trees to get a better look at fruits or flowers, and sat above open hatches, peering intently into the darkness. He'll fall off someday and hurt himself, Tiana complained. I'll keep an eye on that little brat. Yes, Adrien agreed. She's a quick little girl. The man was proud that his daughter was so inquisitive. Tiana was too. But she was tired of watching the active child around the clock. Only here on the fate of the woman did not complain. All the troubles associated with her daughter gave her great pleasure. Sometimes it seemed to Adrien that his wife was overprotective of their only child. It would be easier to treat some things, to give the girl more independence, which she so aspired to. But in the upbringing of Amelie, he tried not to interfere. First, the spouses who have read a mountain of literature about children are more discerning. Secondly, Tiana had dreamed of motherhood for so long, and she was already a mother at a mature age. In their situation, it was easy to turn a blind eye to some things. Amelie adored her parents. She always looked forward to when her father came home from work, to climb on his lap and ask him a million questions, and to play the fun and noisy games that Tiana was incapable of: pillow fights, catch up, hide and seek. Adrien liked to take his daughter for a walk in the park after work. Sometimes Tiana would go with them, but more often she stayed home to clean up in peace and quiet, cook a delicious dinner, a break from the noisy child, after all. At first, father and daughter strolled along the alleys and talked about serious topics, speculated about where flies and fairy bugs wintered, and about the life of the mysterious inhabitants of the pond. They discussed the cartoons Amelie had watched during the day. Adrien smiled as he looked at his daughter, who was so serious and sensible. He thought that she must have a great future ahead of her. Then Adrien took his daughter to the playground and the fun began. Amelie rolled down the slide, climbed the stairs. She didn't do that in front of her mother. She was too worried about her long-awaited treasure. And Amelie also had to get acquainted with the kids right away. The children loved the cheerful and sociable girl. Adrien was pleased that his child so easily finds a common language with peers. The attentive father was sure that his daughter would like it in kindergarten. But Tiana resisted the idea. I quit my job on purpose to take care of the girl myself. I didn't give birth to her to dump her on the state. No, I intend to enjoy motherhood to the fullest. So what? Kindergarten is just daycare for the children of working parents. I'm doing a lot with our girl. I'm developing her. No, let her be with me. It's better that way. Adrien didn't argue, but every once in a while he'd bring up daycare again. There are children there, songs, dances. Tiana prepared her daughter for a career in science, thought that she must follow in her footsteps. And the girl seemed to be doing well. Amelie grasped everything on the fly. Her brain was working, of course, as it should. But Adrien noticed other talents in his daughter. Amelie had an amazing voice, clear, high. When the little girl sang songs from cartoons, Adrien involuntarily froze. He himself once long ago attended music school. He had not achieved any particular success in this field, but the knowledge he had gained was enough to realize that Amelie had a wonderful ear. She reproduced the melodies very accurately. It was a miracle. Another little miracle from Amelie. Maybe we should take her to a music teacher for an audition. Amelie is clearly a talent, Adrien suggested to his wife. She's still a little girl, Tiana said. In music school from the age of 6 or 7 years old. And our daughter does not need it. She will be a major scientist. You'll see, after the baby was born, Tiana felt happy, but she was never the same. She was very anxious, too focused on the baby. Still, it was better than the state she was in when she was trying to get pregnant. Adrien still loved her, loved Tiana, even perhaps more than he had when they were young. They had become very close. They're having a wonderful baby. It's such a blessing. Adrien tried not to pay attention to little things like Tiana's focus on the baby and her excessive anxiety about her daughter. He understood why his wife behaved like that. The man himself often spoiled his daughter. Coming home from work, he bought her gifts just for fun, without reason: sweets, dolls, stuffed animals. It was a joy to see Tiana and Emily light up with joy at the sight of the surprise her father took out of the bag. And even more so when the little girl hugged him with her little arms and whispered, "Thank you, Daddy." Adrien's heart melted with tenderness. He had never imagined it was possible to have such strong feelings for someone. Tiana always tried to make her daughter's birthdays bright and beautiful. She prepared for a grand celebration in advance. She thought up the theme, chose gifts, bought or prepared her own decorations. The second birthday of her daughter was held in the style of Disney princesses. The little girl then adored these cartoons. The third birthday was a ball in the palace of the Underwater King, as Amelia at that age was carried away by a fairy tale about mermaids. The fourth birthday of the girl was held in the land of unicorns. Yes, Tiana managed the almost impossible. In just an hour, she turned the apartment into a magical place, a haven for these fantastic animals. Amelia then adored unicorns, watched cartoons about them, drew them, molded fabulous characters from plasticine. "I wish I could ride one," she said dreamily. Tiana just smiled and waved her hands. "Daughter, you understand, a unicorn. They live so far away, they don't come to our place." "I understand, and it's a pity." Ami sighed. Adrien decided to fulfill his daughter's birthday dream by all means. Adrien went to the racetrack and talked to the pony trainers. He had a wonderful idea and tried to make it a reality. One of the girl instructors was enthusiastic about Adrien's plan. Together they came up with masquerade costumes for a beautiful white pony, which was to represent a unicorn, a twisted plastic mane, Velcro, pink ribbons for the mane and tail, aqua makeup, which was planned to draw hearts on the sides of the animal, a wreath of artificial flowers. All this was to turn a small horse into a fairy tale character. Adrien anticipated in advance how excited his little girl would be. This pleasure, of course, cost a lot of money. But wouldn't you do anything for your favorite little princess? When the main surprise was ready, Adrien thought about the gift. It had to be something themed and very beautiful. The man ordered a plush unicorn through acquaintances from abroad. At that time, there was no such abundance of different toys in children's stores. To get the original character was almost impossible. But the loving father did not stop there. Because the daughter is already 4 years old, she already knows a lot, understands a lot. It is time to give her something beautiful and elegant, purely feminine. Let her get used to it from a young age, Adrien decided. And he ordered in the jewelry workshop a wonderful set of silver bracelet and earrings, made in the form of tiny unicorns, covered with pink enamel. The man had been looking for a master ready to take on such an order for a very long time. The work was difficult. Professionals simply did not want to get involved. In the end, one elderly jeweler decided to do it. He worked for a long time, all the time remodeling and improving something. But in the end, the result was so beautiful that Adrien could not help but sigh in admiration when he saw the set for the first time. Tiana was delighted too. "My God, what a miracle it is." The woman shook her head. "I've never seen anything like it. You are so good." "There is nothing else like it in the world," Adrien assured her, enjoying his wife's reaction. "It's exclusive to Amelie. Look, it has her name engraved in calligraphy on the back of the bracelet. It's so beautiful and sophisticated. A gift for a real lady." Amelie's 4th birthday went just fine. It was perfect. The girl woke up in an apartment decorated with balloons, bright pictures, and cardboard decorations from the unicorn world. Next to her crib was a chair littered with gifts from her parents. There were toys, dressy dresses, and brightly colored books. But more than other gifts, the girl was impressed by the jewelry with unicorns. She asked to put the bracelet on her arm and has not taken it off since. Adrien looked at his happy daughter and smiled. Then all three of them prepared for the guests. They prepared salads, baked a delicious cake, and then decorated it with figures made of mastic. Amélie worked very hard. In the evening the guests came, and the apartment immediately became noisy and cheerful. Grandparents, Tiana and Adriana's acquaintances with children of Amélie's age. The birthday girl was showered with gifts and compliments. But she was not only accepting congratulations, the girl herself wanted to surprise the guests. Amélie in her princess dress stood on a chair and sang for everyone a song from her favorite cartoon about a unicorn. Adrien listened to the pure ringing voice of his girl and his heart shrank with tenderness and joy. Wow! What a miracle fate had bestowed upon him and Tiana. A beautiful, talented daughter, thought the man at that moment for the umpteenth time that he would do everything for Amélie's happiness. Guests applauded loudly, several times called the singer for an encore. Amélie did not refuse. She liked to be the center of attention, liked to sing, liked to receive compliments. Bold, daring, artistic. Adrien decided then that, despite his wife's plans, their girl would still shine on stage. Tiana will understand, he said to himself. And then it was time for the big surprise. Children and adults poured out into the street, huddled on the front porch. A real unicorn was coming toward them from the archway. Amélie jumped with delight. The other children immediately followed suit. Next to the unicorn was a young fairy. The girl instructor tried to let her blonde curls loose on her shoulders and wore a light, long sundress with flowers. Can I go to him? Amélie asked the fairy, not believing her happiness. She almost cried with delight. Her biggest dream had come true. Of course you can. He'll be happy to take you for a ride, answered the fairy. Amélie made 2 honorable circles around the yard, then jumped down from the unicorn, stroked his face and asked, "Can he ride my guests too?" "Of course he's here to make your party perfect." The little guests took turns to sit on the unicorn's back and rode around the yard with joyful, shining faces. Amélie's party was unforgettable for them as well. Adrien looked at his girl and thought that she was not only smart and beautiful, but also very kind and sensitive. She took care of others. At the age of 4, she asked the fairy to give her little guests a ride on a unicorn. What 4-year-old could have thought of that? It was a wonderful day. From it all, those involved left a lot of bright impressions and no less bright photos. On one photo, Amélie was captured in the arms of a new plush unicorn. A silver bracelet glistened on her wrist. A thin tiara crowned her head. The girl smiled broadly into the lens. She was truly happy at this moment. It was this picture that Tiana handed over to the investigators just 3 months later. It happened on a warm and sunny September evening. It was Indian summer, the most wonderful season of autumn golden trees, illuminated by the gentle sun, leaves rustling underfoot. That evening, Tiana and Amélie decided not to stay at home and took advantage of the wonderful weather to take a walk in the park. The more so because of the city day festivities. My wife called Adrien too. It would be great to walk through the park as a family, the 3 of us. But the man refused. He had a lot of work he had taken home from the factory. They had a serious inspection on the way from New York, some reports that needed to be finished urgently. "No, unfortunately, I will not be able to accompany my 2 beautiful ladies." Adrien shook his head, "although I would like it very much." Amélie pouted. She was charming in her light red dress and red beret, flirtatiously pushed to the side. 2 tight pigtails decorated with pink silk ribbons rested on her shoulders. On her feet were new patent shoes, not quite modern. The image was original and charming. Tiana tried to dress the girl like a doll, looking for stylish and unusual things for her. Amélie almost always stood out among the other children. "Okay, fine, but I have to work." Adrien waved his hands. "But don't worry. This weekend I'll go with you to the ponds. I promise." The ponds. Amélie was so excited. "That's great. We'll ride the Ferris wheel and feed the ducks buns. Yes?" "Yes," Adrien smiled. "And then we'll go to the cafe. Do you have your favorite berry pancakes? Okay?" "All right. Now you 2 have fun alone without me." Then tell me everything before you go to bed and listen to your mom, okay? I will. Amelie reached out to hug her father. The sleeves of her red coat pulled up, exposing her wrist, on one of which the silver bracelet with unicorns glittered. The girl never parted with her favorite piece of jewelry. One of the earrings, however, had already gotten lost. The clasp was unreliable. The second, now practically useless, was in a box on Amelie's desk. Okay, we're off. Tiana smiled at her husband. Adrien hugged his wife, kissed his daughter, walked them to the elevator, waved at the closing doorway. This picture still stood in front of his eyes, dressed up happy Amelie, smiling at her father. Adrien had not realized then that he would never see his little girl again. He didn't even have a hint of foreboding. Adrien went back to the apartment, sat down at the computer, plunged into the numbers. Needed to take advantage of a moment of peace and quiet at home. Amelie would be back in a couple or 3 hours. And of course she would want to share her impressions with her father, to tell him about the walk. And then he would have to put aside all his work and listen attentively to his daughter. Adrien knew that this is very important for children, such contact with parents. But the man heard the sound of the key turning in the lock after about an hour. It was too early. Tiana came flying into the living room. When Adrien looked at her, he knew something terrible had happened. The disheveled black hair, the unnatural pallor, the trembling, cracked lips, and worst of all, the panic in her eyes. Amelie never came back, she blurted out, looking hopefully at her husband. He shook his head negatively. At that moment, an icy hand clutched his heart. Terrible. But you were with her. What happened? The man mumbled confusedly. Instead of answering, Tiana rushed to the phone and dialed the police number. Only later, much later, did Adrien learn the details of what had happened. First, there was the rushing around the park looking for her daughter, talking to the police, trying to calm Tiana, who did become hysterical. However, before that, she answered all the questions of the police in detail and thoroughly. The search for the little girl, who disappeared in the park, began immediately. Squads of police officers combed the neighborhood, volunteers joined them. The trouble that fell on the 2 unfortunate parents left no one indifferent. The police had a hard time convincing Tiana and Adrien to stay put in the apartment. The only argument that worked was that the girl could come home on her own. We need someone to be home at that moment. You're not going to help with the search anyway, the young man in the uniform persuaded the worried parents. Unnecessary emotions, aggravation of the situation. People should work calmly, without distractions, you know. Adrien sat on the couch, hugging his wife tightly. Tiana was shivering violently. She blamed herself incessantly, using the harshest of expressions. Adrien felt the urge to blame Tiana for everything at first. She hadn't looked. She hadn't been attentive enough to let the child out of her sight. But seeing the state of his wife, the man held back. Why kill a man who's already in a state of grief? It could have happened to anyone. It was just an accident. It's not Tiana's fault. We had such a nice walk in the alleys, the woman sobbed, sharing her memories. Amelie was fascinated by everything that was happening in the park. Animators, photographers with a monkey, music, smells of cotton candy and popcorn. Master classes for children. The park was crowded that day. Of course, it was City Day. The festivities have always attracted people from all over Chicago to this place. The epicenter of the celebration was the summer stage in the center of the park. It was there that the festive concert with the best children's groups of the state took place. Little artists sang, danced, played musical instruments, and acted out skits from famous works. In between, the hosts held contests among the young audience and generously awarded prizes to the winners. That's where Amelie wanted to go. I didn't want to go there with her, Tiana said. The crowd was too big. She's just a little girl. Why did we have to jostle? Amelie wanted to see the concert so badly. She begged me, pleaded with me, even tried to bribe me. She was just going for it, as always. Adrien nodded. He understood perfectly well how it was. Amelie herself dreamed of performing on stage someday. Their girl was a born artist. Of course, there was no stopping her. So Tiana and Amelie found themselves in the crowd. The mother thought her daughter would see that there was no way to get to the stage. Maybe she would even be frightened by such a crowd of people. And then it would be easier to distract her, to take her somewhere less crowded. But no way. The little girl persistently moved through the crowd closer to the stage, and then a local rock band came out to play. It was a young band, but the musicians had already made it on big TV. Tiana didn't know that celebrities would be the highlight of the concert. Otherwise, she wouldn't have dragged her daughter into the crowd. She knew what that meant. There was such a crush, the woman sobs. People, they went crazy. I felt like everyone in the park was rushing closer to the stage. I was so scared. I wanted to take Amelie in my arms, but I couldn't. We were separated, and she was lost in the sea of people. Tiana screamed, calling for her daughter, but the music was so loud that the poor woman couldn't even hear herself, and the fans around her were singing at the top of their lungs. The concert ended and the crowd quickly dispersed. Tiana ran around the stage, asking everyone she met if they had seen a girl in a red coat, a little girl with 2 pigtails. People shook their heads in the negative and went about their business. The woman ran along the paths and alleys, inspected the playgrounds, and searched with her eyes for a small bright red spot. Amelie was dressed so brightly she must stand out from the crowd, but the girl was nowhere to be found. Finally, the unhappy woman came across an old guard. The old man listened to her and made a suggestion, which Tiana grasped at like a drowning man grasping at straws. So maybe your little girl has been home for a long time? Lost sight of you and ran home? Does she know the way? She knows the way. Tiana nodded and rushed home. There was hope, almost certainty. Is Amelie home? Of course she's home. Where else would she be? But in the apartment, the woman was met only by a surprised Adrien. The first time the search was active, on the posts and walls of the city appeared orientations on the missing girl. Tiana herself chose the photo for these ads, the one taken at Amelie's birthday party. By the end of the second 24 hours, volunteers and police officers began to talk about the fact that it is now unlikely that the child will be found alive. Usually a happy outcome is possible within the first few hours of a missing person. Adrien and Tiana didn't want to believe that. They searched the internet for stories of children returning home alive and unharmed after weeks and months of being missing. It really does happen, and these are not one-time occurrences. The spouses couldn't eat, sleep, or drink for the first time. They didn't know where their little girl was or what was happening to her. How can you swallow a single bite of food in such a situation? Both of them became gaunt and thin. Tiana blamed herself constantly. Periodically, she would get hysterical. But worst of all were the periods when the woman sat swaying slightly and staring at one point with an absent look. Adrien thought it was her way of disconnecting from reality to reset her nervous system. But it looked very scary. During these difficult days, the man was afraid to leave his wife unattended. A few weeks passed. Adrien went back to work. Things were a bit distracting, forcing him to switch gears. Those scary thoughts were still present in the background. Where's Amelie? What's happening to her now? They loved their little girl so much, cared for her so much. The little girl knew nothing but love and attention and warmth. And those people around her now, how are they treating the little girl? Amelie must be very scared. And of course she misses her mom, her dad, her home. Crying, probably. Adrien's heart was breaking at the thought. Tiana was troubled too. There was no face on her. Her mother and Adrien's mother were always visiting her. They were afraid that she might kill herself. They convinced Tiana that Amelie needed her. What will it be like for the girl without her mother when she comes back? But it was very hard for Tiana. Guilt pressed down on her with an unbearable weight. Not being able to hold her daughter plunged her into a deep sadness. Sometimes the woman could not cope with her emotions. She tore her clothes, threw dishes against the walls, screamed like a wounded animal. Adrien did not stop her or comfort her at such times. 3 months had passed since Amelie had gone missing. It was already winter. Had the search died down? No, not at all. It hadn't stopped, but it wasn't as active. The investigators said it was a long shot, but they'd keep trying. And the couple also learned some scary numbers. It turns out that every year around the world a lot of children disappear, and then they are never found alive or dead. Adrien never even thought about it before. How does this planet have so much grief and misery? This is what kind of world they brought their tender, talented girl into and did not save her. The main version of the investigation was kidnapping, because if the girl had just gotten lost in the city, she would have been found long ago. The same would have happened if Amelie had an accident, hit by a car, fell through a manhole, fell into some pit. But the girl disappeared without a trace. So someone went to a lot of trouble to cover their tracks. Closer to spring, one of the volunteers found Amelie's things, her toy and beret, at the dump. An investigator called the parents to identify the clothes. Tiana immediately said with certainty that it was her daughter's coat and beret. She couldn't be mistaken, for it was Tiana who had bought Amelie the beautiful outfit. "What does it mean?" Adrien asked hopefully. "It's hard to say," shrugged the investigator. "Perhaps it is encouraging news. The kidnapper obviously did not intend to harm the girl immediately. He got rid of the clothes because they were too conspicuous to attract attention." "That's good," Tiana whispered. Somehow they were sure that Amelie herself would be found soon. No news for so long. And then there was such a clue. Except nothing of the sort happened. The case stalled again. Adrien tried to get his wife to go back to work. He knew she'd be welcomed back with open arms as an ex-employee, even after such a long hiatus. A favorite job would help Tiana get back to life, feel needed, useful. Sitting in four walls was draining her of her strength. "What are you talking about?" Tiana was annoyed. "I'll go to work, and at that moment Amelie will come home, and no one will be there." I understand Tiana's situation was very difficult. She stayed at home, leaving the apartment only when her husband came home. Tiana scoured the internet for stories of happy returns of children. She made all sorts of assumptions about the fate of her daughter Amelie. 13 years had passed. Tiana had completely given up, turned into a pale, wrinkled, devastated old woman. She began to have serious heart problems. She needed to be hospitalized, but she refused. "Look at what you've done to yourself," Adrien said painfully, seeing her condition. She could not accept the loss. Adrien, of course, also felt sad and worried. He realized that the longing for his lost daughter would remain with him forever. But unlike his wife, the man accepted the situation, returned to life, and began to work. And Tiana persistently brought herself to nervous exhaustion and illness, continuing to blame herself. At night, she often woke up from nightmares. She refused to go to the hospital. They were regularly visited by ambulance because of heart attacks. Doctors gave her injections and strongly recommended hospitalization, but Tiana wrote refusal after refusal. Adrien couldn't convince her she wouldn't accept any of his arguments. Sometimes he thought it would have been better if Amelie had not been found alive. Then Tiana would have finally accepted the terrible truth. There would have been some certainty. As it was, the case was barely progressing. True, over the years, the couple had been called to the station several times to identify children who looked like Amelie. The missing girl's profile was all over the country. We've had calls from all over the country. I understand the situation was extremely difficult for both spouses. Concerned citizens called, saying they had seen a girl who looked like Amelie near a store, on a playground near a pond. Adrien and Tiana looked through photos, surveillance footage. Sometimes they'd even been shown homeless girls found at a train station somewhere, but they never saw Amelie. "Take a closer look," the investigator asked. "Maybe she's yours? It's been a long time. The girl has changed, grown up." But the couple only shook their heads. They would not recognize their daughter even grown up. These calls made Tiana's condition worse each time. First desperate hope, then another bitter disappointment. All of this brought up again the years of worry in her soul. She would become hysterical, calling herself names. Adrien cost a great deal of labor to calm his wife. Acquaintances advised Adrien to leave Tiana. "She does not live, and you prevent you from returning to normal life. Have you already accepted the fact that Amelie cannot return? You have a chance to remarry, maybe you'll be a father again." But Adrien couldn't think of such a thing. He still loved Tiana. His wife was the closest person to him. They'd been through so much together. These Strosanos had brought them closer together, united them. The man no longer hoped that Amelie would be found, but he still believed that Tiana would come to her senses, get over her grief, become almost her old self, and they might go traveling again. A change of scenery would do them both good. But it didn't work out. Another heart attack took the life of a not yet old woman right in the arms of a distraught Adrien. The ambulance didn't make it this time. The doctors said it was all going to come to this. Tiana brought herself to this, did not cope with the disaster. So Adrien was alone. He grieved for his wife, regretting her ruined life. The man went over in his memory their life since the disappearance of his daughter and tried to understand if there was anything else he could do for his wife to get her out of this state. By all accounts, no, Adrien had done everything he could. Still, the worm of doubt kept him in a state of doubt. A few years later, Stacy came into Adrien's life. The man was approaching 60 at the time. He did not think that such a change in his fate was possible. It was one of his colleagues, a divorced woman, who single-handedly raised 2 sons. The boys had gone their separate ways, one studying abroad, the other living and working in a distant seaside town. Stacy, accustomed to taking care of someone, strosala from loneliness and lack of demand. Somehow it happened that Adrien and Stacy became unnoticeably close. The man was easy and calm next to this warm, caring woman. It turns out that it is so wonderful when someone thinks about you and tries to do something nice for you. And Adrien liked to feel patronized and protected again. Soon they were living together in Adrien's apartment. The man had renovated all the rooms long ago, so that nothing reminded him of family life. Because it was too painful to see the curtains, chosen by Tiana, and to look at the children's furniture, specially purchased for Amelie, and to realize that her daughter and beloved wife were gone and would never be around again. Stacy, of course, knew the life story of her chosen one. She supported him, listened attentively to Adrien's outpourings, which made him feel better. She hugged him, stroked his head, didn't ask too many questions. Adrien, in turn, listened with interest to Stacy's stories about her life. The woman had had a hard time too, but in a different way. Her husband had been an alcoholic, and he'd gotten his hands dirty. It was hard to get rid of him. Yes, and alone to pull 2 sons too was not easy. But all these were the usual difficulties of life, which did not break Stacy, but only hardened her. Adrien, however, fate has prepared a much more terrible test. However, the man was able to survive his grief. Of course, thoughts of Amelie still lingered in Adrien's mind. He often wondered if his daughter was still alive, and if so, how she was doing. Amelie was now a grown-up girl, just over 20. A beautiful girl, to be sure. The memory of Amelie could trigger anything. Right now, that trigger was this curious little girl. She bored her parents with her questions. The family was still walking nearby Adrien. The man took one last look at the cute child with a smile and turned the other way. He felt like walking past the fountain. A small crowd had gathered in the square. Adrien didn't understand at first what was the reason for such interest of the passers-by, and then suddenly he heard a clear, ringing, high voice. Someone was singing there at the fountain, hidden from Adrien's eyes by the backs of people. An invisible child was singing a familiar tune from the unicorn cartoon, Amelie's favorite cartoon. The young singer's voice sounded very much like Adrien's daughter's. The man even had tears in his eyes. The longing for his daughter squeezed the man's heart with renewed strength. But it was nothing. He was used to it by now. Now Adrien, of course, couldn't pass it by. The man made his way through the crowd and froze, amazed at the sight he saw. On the side of the fountain stood a girl about Amelie's age when she had disappeared. She reminded Adrien subtly of his daughter, though she was clearly a little gypsy girl. Brown skin, long dark loose hair, black eyebrows arched, and big brown eyes. She was dressed in a colorful blouse with long sleeves and a floor-length skirt decorated with lush waves. On the girl's neck was a massive necklace, not suitable for such a tiny girl. The gypsy girl diligently played a familiar melody, dancing to the beat. The listeners smiled and generously poured coins and bills into the box at her feet. The girl, seeing how she was being received, tried even harder. She suddenly raised her arms, making another dance pause. On her thin wrists glittered bracelets. Adrien was stunned. He recognized one of the bracelets. And how not to recognize this unique thing, a pink unicorn, an exclusive for his daughter. Of course, to be completely sure, you need to see the jewelry closer. But Adrien was already very clear. The girl finished her song, the adults clapped for her, and began to disperse. Adrien was still standing behind the lamppost. He didn't know what to do. Should he approach the child, ask her where she got the bracelet? But he didn't want to frighten the little gypsy girl. It was better to wait until one of the adults came for her. I'm sure they're around here somewhere. I don't think they'd leave a little girl like that all alone and unattended. And indeed, a couple of minutes later, a teenager of about 12 to 13 years old came up to the girl swarthy, black-eyed and curly-haired. He smiled at the singer and asked something. She answered. The boy patted her on the head, took her hand. Then he picked up a box of money with his free hand and led the gypsy away from the square. Worried, Adrien followed the children. Really, what to do? Turn to this boy. There was no doubt that he would take the little girl in his arms and rush away. Light and quick on his feet. He's obviously a cautious boy. Too much attention would only scare him off. So Adrien continued to follow the children. Meanwhile, the gypsies passed the main square, walked through the maze of narrow central streets and found themselves on the outskirts of the city. Here were old private houses, and mostly elderly people lived here. Beyond this street was a vacant lot, and beyond it was a bypass road. From afar, Adrien could see that this was the place where the Tabor had settled wagons, people sitting around fires in groups, and a merry murmur. So that was where the children were going. Adrien probably should have followed them, talked to the adults. But how would he be received there? It was a little scary to go, but what could he do? For the first time in so many years, there was a clue about Amélie. Maybe it would lead Adrien to his daughter. What if he finally found out what had happened to his princess? The man followed the children with a determined step. The boy noticed the surveillance. He turned around and looked at Adrien with a suspicious look, but his adults were very close by. So the teenager felt at ease. He was in his own territory. The boy only quickened his step. The little girl could barely keep up with him, treading the grass with her tiny booted feet. Then a young gypsy woman came out from the corner of the last house on the street. It was at once evident that this was the mother of the little singer. The little girl snatched her hand out of the boy's palm, rushed to the woman, and hugged her. The beautiful gypsy covered the girl's face with kisses and whispered something in her ear. The young singer laughed happily. Adrien stood there, unable to move. The young gypsy woman, her hair, her eyes, her eyebrows, her lips, she looked remarkably like Adrien's own grandmother. The same one that Amélie looked so much like. The man felt as if he had been doused with ice water. No, it couldn't be. The tanned face, the white teeth and smile, the massive gold earrings in her ears, and the mole on her cheek that Adrien remembered so well. This mole was shaped like a small heart. Amélie, too, was happy to have the same mark on her cheek as the unicorn from the cartoon. The woman noticed the stare of the stranger. The smile slowly faded from her face. She held the baby tighter to her and wanted to leave. But Adrien called out to her. "Amélie? Amélie?" The gypsy stopped. She stared at the older man for a moment, then walked toward him, still holding her daughter close to her. "I'm sorry," Adrien said. "Don't be frightened, please. I'm not going to hurt you. It's just that I need to." The man blurted out in surprise to himself. It was the first thing that came into his head. The dark-haired girl. She's from the Tabor. Everyone knows that gypsies make money by fortune-telling. Fortune-telling. The girl grinned. The baby in her arms smiled too. "All right, I'll tell fortunes." The boy nodded obediently and hurried to where the gypsies had stopped, following the teenager, who had almost reached the vacant lot. "Her name is Clementine." Adrien smiled, looking at the gypsy's face. He became more and more convinced that this was Amélie, his disappeared, grown-up daughter. He was aware that he might be wishful thinking, but there were too many coincidences. The song from his daughter's favorite cartoon sung by little Clementine, the bracelet on the girl's hand, the appearance of the young gypsy. "Yes, my daughter's name is Clementine," the girl finally answered. "What can I tell you?" "Many years ago, a long time ago, my daughter was kidnapped. She went for a walk with her mother. They got into a crowd. There was a crush, but the girl was never found. I'd like to know what happened to her. I'll pay you whatever you want." "Kidnapped daughter?" The gypsy woman's voice trembled. "It's scary, very scary. I'm not going to guess such things. I have a daughter myself. I don't want to get into trouble." "Then the question is, how did your little girl get that bracelet?" "Because my daughter had one just like it." Adrien realized that now the gypsy woman would turn around and leave, so he asked the main question. I also have a question. Why did you call me Amelie? That was my daughter's name, and I thought you were her. Yes, Adrien admitted, dazed by the direction their dialogue had taken. My name is Oliver. Gypsies call me that. And the bracelet I've been wearing all this time has the name Amelie written on the back. That's why I came to you. Because you called me by that name. It's strange and interesting. I can't believe it. Apparently you really are my father. Tell me about yourself, please. Who are your parents? How long have you been in the Tabor? Were you born there? Oliver shook her head negatively. No, I'm a foundling. My father said he found me ragged and hungry at the train station. Oliver continued thoughtfully. I don't remember that time myself. I was too young. But that bracelet has always been with me, ever since I realized myself. They said Grandma Rose gave it to me, and now I realize it's from another life. I always knew it. I ordered it for my daughter Amelie's 4th birthday. Adrien nodded. It is the only one of its kind in the whole world. There could be no mistake. It was Amelie's. I think that's you. Tell me about yourself. Oliver sighed. I will. From the very first time we were in this city, I immediately felt like I'd been here once. A lot of things were familiar. The cityscapes, even the smells, the sensations. And now this meeting. I want to figure it all out, too. Little Oliver always knew that Father Chicharin picked her up at the train station. Your relatives abandoned you. White people often do that, get rid of unwanted children, he said. We Roma have a completely different attitude to children. Chicharin's family already had 4 sons growing up. The only thing missing was a girl, so he took the little girl with him. Mother Camille, Grandma Rose, brothers. The young woman looked at Adrien with a challenge. He realized what was going on. If he really thought he was the girl's father, then he had once let it happen that a little girl was left alone at the train station, hungry, ragged, dirty. How did I end up at the train station? Asked the gypsy girl, looking the man straight in the eye. Didn't you keep an eye on your daughter? Or maybe you decided to get rid of her that way? What are you saying? Adrien objected. Our little Amelie was the most precious thing to us. Suddenly the man began to tell about those happy 4 years of life, that in his and Tiana's family lived a wonderful daughter. Adrien first told a long story about how hard they had gotten their daughter, then told about her early childhood. It was nice to remember those bright, warm moments. It turns out that he had forgotten almost nothing. And the joy of Amelie's first steps, and their joint travels and walks, and wonderful holidays that Tiana arranged for her daughter. Our girl loved unicorns and sang well, Adrien said. Just like your daughter Clementine. By the way, how does she know the song she sang at the fountain? It's our Amelie's favorite song. She also sang it in a very similar manner. Oliver didn't answer right away. It was as if she were trying to remember something. I taught it to her, she said at last. Something from my past life has stayed with me, not just the bracelet. I remembered that song. I strangely enough could read at the age of 4. That skill is still with me. We don't teach girls to read, only boys, and even then, superficially. But I read. Sometimes I have dreams about people who love me very much. I don't remember their faces at all, but I remembered warm, caring embraces. I thought I was making it up for myself. I've always had a good imagination. What else? Adrien asked. There's more. And just now when you were talking about it, I remembered something. Yes, I did ride a unicorn, a real unicorn. I dreamed about that scene several times. And the unicorn was exactly as you just described it. So, are we really daughter and father? We can say for sure only after the DNA test, Adrien said with a trembling voice. But it seems to be true. Oliver pressed her fingers to her temples, furrowing her brow, just like her mother did when she was worried. What are we supposed to do now? The girl asked confusedly, looking to the man for support. I think we should check everything out so that we both know for sure, and also to restore your documents. I don't doubt that you are Amelie, too, Adrien said. There are too many coincidences. I think you should go home or... Adrien's heart sank with a premonition of trouble. ... Or do you want to live in a Tabor? You said you were happy with the gypsies? I did when I was a child. Oliver shook her head. When I grew up, things changed. The children in the Tabor are treated very well, but as adults, life isn't sweet. A lot of chores. The need to obey the men without question. A husband can even beat his wife for disobedience. And nothing will happen to him. I can't do what I want to do, read, walk, study. And I'm forced to cheat people for money. That's the most unpleasant thing. But if I don't get the money in the evening, I'll be punished. I've been punished more than once. Then Oliver told the story of how Stacy gave her away in marriage. She was about 16 years old at the time. The family had chosen a good groom for their only daughter, the son of a well-to-do gypsy. Adrien was as young as the bride. He was passionately in love with another, as the whole Tabor knew. But that girl was no match for him, so marriage was out of the question. I cried before the wedding, Oliver recalled. I didn't want to get married, even though Adrien was young and handsome and wealthy, but I felt like a child. And I knew about my fiancé's feelings for someone else. The whole Tabor knew about it, but we did get married. Parents on both sides demanded the continuation of the family. That's how Clementine came into the family. Oliver never knew she could love someone so much. Her daughter became the meaning of her life, the light in the window. Adrien was indifferent to me, and my daughter Oliver continued. He was running around to that girl he was seeing. Again, everyone in the Tabor knew it, but the man was allowed to behave that way. Stacy hadn't minded or been jealous. Now she was completely absorbed in her daughter, singing songs to her, making up beautiful outfits for her, braiding her hair. Clementine inherited her mother's talent. She also sang and danced well. Naturally, the Tabor decided to use the child's gift to the full. When the girl grew up, she was made a street singer, just like her mother. Once the girl performed in the squares of various cities and did it, it must be said, with pleasure. The audience applauded the little girl, generously paying for the performance. Clementine smiled happily. It was very disturbing to me, Oliver said. I realized that the little girl would have a future like mine. She wouldn't study, she wouldn't get a good profession. And she would continue to entertain people with her voice as she grew older and lost her childlike directness. She'll be a fortune teller. I dreamed of a different future for me and my daughter, Oliver continued. It seemed to me that we should both live differently, but it seemed impossible. I think they kidnapped you in the crowd, Adrien said, looking at his daughter. Yes, now he was certain that Emily was in front of him, and he was immensely sorry for the lost years that his daughter had to spend in the Tabor, among strangers, obeying alien traditions and strict rules. But now everything would change. Is that possible? Oliver shook her head. It had never happened in my lifetime. But grandmother Rada told me that childless gypsy couples used to pick up children on the streets of towns. They picked out little ones who were unlikely to remember the past and raised them as their own children. And Grandma Rada said that the gypsies tried to kidnap dark-haired babies so as not to cause unnecessary hurrying to catch the last bus. Tiffany saw the girl. Deciding to walk her home, she froze when she saw. Tiffany was not particularly attracted to agriculture, but she was not irritated by the 6 acres of land. She had a cooperative nature, especially when it came to the interests of people close to her. It had been her mother's hobby, but since Tiffany loved it, she'd learned to find joy in going to her home. It was good that the dacha was not far from their home. If you go light, it was quite possible to get there in half an hour, for example, on a weekend in the summer. In the morning grip, it was even pleasant to make a walk. However, it was not necessary to make a march. Public transportation came to the rescue. A surprisingly long bus route ran past the massif, connecting the railroad station with a large factory almost on the border of the city. Such a neighborhood turned out to be very fortunate. After all, in a sense, the modest plot, which in the past years had been particularly difficult for the whole country and their family in particular, became a real salvation. Whether it was so coincidental, or whether the quarrel between mom and dad was a consequence of the events that took place, but only the man filed for divorce. All his numerous relatives, who used to often go to them on occasion, and what is much more often, without reason, as if completely forgot the way to the hospitable apartment of Tiffany's grandparents. The girl once overheard a conversation between adults and realized that her father is not only that the car and garage for himself left behind, so also part of the other property would not mind to get. only failed dacha and apartment allocated to the grandmother. So after the divorce-greedy former tongue did not get a centimeter, the offended man paid a tiny alimony, and with Tiffany meetings did not look for meetings, crossed out of his life, as if he did not have a daughter. The girl was unpleasant, right up to tears, but she realized that her sobs upset her loved ones, so she carefully hid her sadness. The family had shrunk dramatically to Tiffany, her mom, and Peter's grandparents. One had to move on with life. Visiting the fazenda and struggling to harvest crops were perhaps the most effective ways of coping. They grew potatoes, cucumbers, and carrots on 6 hectares. Since they no longer had a car, it would have been much more problematic to transport the crops home without a bus. And so they carried home even tomatoes, which did not always have time to turn red in the fleeting summer heat. The green fruits, after the usual household processing in the kitchen, were transformed into a wonderful salad that livened up their meager menu. Under the guidance of her grandmother Maggie and her mother, the very young Tiffany peeled the carrots required by the recipe and hummed a simple song about the evergreen tomato and the magical land of lemonade. Thinking back, the woman marveled at the optimism of the adults in her family. They showed it even in their darkest moments. Soon after Tiffany's father divorced her mother, there was such a sad period when there was no money in the house at all. The father completely, including child support, disappeared from his daughter's life a few years after the divorce. The grandparents and mom worked at the same factory. And there, as luck would have it, wages were delayed, severely delayed. After a few months, the money from the modest savings melted away. Tiffany realized that her relatives were protecting her, trying to shield her from excessive involvement in adult problems. However, it was impossible to ignore the fact that store-bought sweets and even her favorite cheap sausage, which turned into a bizarre funnel after cooking, were almost absent from the table. In an effort to be helpful, Tiffany ran around the neighborhood, collecting bottles in a bag sewn by her grandmother. Then the girl turned in fines, because for clean glassware in the reception center paid a little more, and bought home bread or something else necessary. For a short period there were problems with transportation. Buses stopped following the schedule because their number on the line was drastically reduced. As a result, it became almost impossible to squeeze into the cabin with bags, so Grandpa Peter designed 2 handy maneuverable bag carts. The one that was larger in capacity, the man most often drove himself, and when for some reason could not go to the dacha, always warned. "Girls, how will you go home from the farm? Take a cart and load these." The smaller cart was usually driven by Nina, Tiffany's mom. And when the load was not too heavy, she entrusted it to her daughter. In this way, together and supporting each other, they overcame all difficulties. By the time Tiffany got her passport, she had become disillusioned with almost everything male, and taking her mom's maiden name, became Lucina after her grandfather Peter. He alone was a real pillar in their little family. Resourceful, optimistic, humorous about the most difficult situations, Grandpa Peter managed to always and everything in time, and never once reproached his daughter Mary for not keeping his marriage with her husband. Tiffany had often thought lately about the fact that her parents had split up when her mother had been almost as old as she was now. In some ways their fates were similar. Tiffany's marriage, too, had crumbled like a sandcastle under the onslaught of fleeing waves. However, she and her husband Victor had no children. It was consensual at first. Although Tiffany was already 26 years old, they decided to live for themselves. Then somehow abruptly Victor got involved in a career race. And it so happened that he, successful and purposeful, was carried away by his colleague, the same energetic and ambitious. 3 years of calm and outwardly prosperous marriage was defenseless before passionate passion. However, this turn of fate, Tiffany did not consider this tragedy. After quite civilized divorce has passed almost 2 years, and even a slight regret, perhaps, not left. It was much more difficult for the fragile mother. The child, though entering the difficult age of adolescence, must be brought up, dressed, fed, and times were troubled. Although it was tight then, but still more often Tiffany's memories of the first 15 years of her life had a light tinge of sadness. After all, Grandpa Peter and Grandma Maggie were alive then. Their family had dealt with adversity together. It was much easier financially now, and Tiffany felt incredibly sorry that they didn't see both daughter and granddaughter living quite well. Sometimes, though, it seemed to Tiffany, especially at the cottage, that her grandparents were not far away. It was as if she heard her grandmother's gentle voice from somewhere to the side of the house. "Tiffany, come here. The raspberries are ripe, come and eat." Or grandfather will enter the gate, smiling, looking triumphant, showing a bucket with caught fish, and will ask his wife, daughter and granddaughter, "Well, honorable ladies, what will you taste today, soup, cooked or fried fish?" How many pleasant things were associated with the cottage. Now it has partially lost its role as a food base. Potato plantation reduced to a few bushes, just to eat young boiled tubers with dill, and gave way to a flower bed. Of course, there were still beds for tomatoes and cucumbers, but the crop was now mostly fruits and berries. Most importantly, though, it was easy to find a peacefulness to which sadness was mixed in the small plot, where probably every handful of earth was familiar. Tiffany and her mother also enjoyed going to the cottage, but it had been 2 weeks since her mother had been in a sanitarium at her daughter's insistence. The ordeal of her youth had taken its toll. Yesterday on the phone, her mother asked her to pick berries, water the plantings, and deal with the weeds that had surely grown. And Tiffany had allotted the second half of Wednesday without objection to go to the cottage. She left work early, as there was nothing urgent, and set off. Tiffany picked currants, weeded the cultivated plants, watered the plants, and filled containers with water. When she was tired, she took a bite of the bun she had thoughtfully brought with her and made a morsel, the best way to fight the heat and fatigue, much better than a sweet, cold drink. She lay down to rest for a while and suddenly fell asleep. Tiffany's awakening was swift. The transition from summer twilight to a velvet night was certainly a pleasant moment, but only if one had time to enjoy it. Right now, that luxury was beyond the woman's reach. The clock on her smartphone screen mockingly suggested that she had to hurry, or the last scheduled bus would leave for home without her. In that case, either she would have to take a walk at a time not too suitable for that, or spend the night at the dacha. Then she would have to rush home on the morning bus, leave the harvest and fly to work on the wings of responsibility. Tiffany quickly put the harvest in her bag and hurried to the bus stop. A woman was in a hurry, and when she saw a skinny little girl sitting on a bed of huge tires near one of the lots, she passed by. Tiffany took a few steps, but a vague realization prevented her from going any further. An elementary school-aged child alone had no business being outside. Tiffany was familiar with the owners of this lot since they had purchased it, so she could definitely say she'd never seen this little girl before. Of course, the girl could have been brought in for a visit and just out for a walk. But the dark windows of the cottage made it clear that it was empty. Either everyone was sleeping there, having forgotten about the little guest who had gone for a walk. The second assumption was obviously ridiculous, so she was unlikely to have anything to do with the owners of the plot near which she had settled. Even in the not very bright light of the lanterns that chased the darkness out of the cottage, the girl's unhappy look indicated that she had been caught up in some difficult life situation. Of course, Tiffany became alarmed. Could this supposedly chance encounter be part of some scam? She'd recently read a story on the internet on her way home from work about a man who'd almost gotten into a lot of trouble because of his helpfulness, and had only miraculously escaped from a trap set by criminals. No, the woman firmly rejected suspicions of the girl's involvement in fraud. Of course, the possibility of criminal background of her appearance in the dacha remained, and Tiffany's intuition was screaming, "This little stranger needs help." Mentally brushing aside her fears, the woman turned and asked, "Are you expecting someone, or are you lost?" The girl shuddered and said, "Excuse me, but I need help. I went into the bus. There were a lot of people. I wanted to pay the fare. I didn't have my wallet in my bag." Here's the revised text with the sequel. "I had my school pass and money in there. They even took out my cell phone," the girl continued. "It's a simple push-button phone, but it still hurt. I tried to explain to the conductor that I must have had all my valuables taken from me in the crowd. She got mad and told me to walk. So here I am, walking to the dachas. I turned around to wait out the heat. Tried to ask for money, but no one will give me any." Tiffany sat down next to the girl on the tire and asked, "Where are you going?" Judging by the address the girl had given her, she had to catch a bus to the city center, just like Tiffany. The woman didn't hesitate and commanded, "Come on then, let's go faster. I'll pay your fare." The girl was incredibly excited and, taking one of Tiffany's bags of berries to help, kept saying thank you on the way to the bus stop. Soon the woman and the girl were already sitting in the stuffy salon, and the stranger asked, "You me, please, your phone number dictate. I'll memorize it and return it to you later." Tiffany looked closely at her companion. Her initial assumption that she was about 7 years old had been wrong. She was clearly older by her judgment, the way she constructed her phrases. The woman smiled. "Don't worry, I won't be poor. What's your name, girl?" "Janie," she introduced herself. "Nice to meet you." "I'm Tiffany." "Well, we meet again. Maybe we should let your family know that you're okay and that you're on your way home." Janie lowered her head and confessed. "Thanks. But I don't remember my mom's phone number by heart." The woman noticed that her companion, apparently tired from the day's worries, was falling into and out of sleep, and she put her shoulder to her. "Don't be shy, rest. I'll wake you up before your stop." The girl, desperately holding back a yawn, asked again, "Do you have farther to go?" Tiffany nodded. She didn't want to make the girl feel uncomfortable by explaining that she had decided to walk her straight home and hand her over to her relatives. The central city neighborhood where Adrien was headed was too dubious. There, old houses growing into the ground, neighbored with new high-rises, and the tenants, according to media reports, were being resettled in improved neighborhoods. The townspeople, of course, understood that the former residents of the center found themselves literally on the outskirts, and the most intransigent were simply squeezed out by unfavorable circumstances to an unprofitable resettlement. Wooden houses regularly flared up like matches, making room with minimal cost to the developers. Occasionally, as she drove by, Tiffany noticed that many of the buildings were vacant, or more likely were havens for antisocial elements and hooligans. Of course, the woman was uneasy, but it was unwise to walk the streets of the neighborhood with a girl at this late hour. Adrien trustingly nestled into the shoulder of her unexpected patroness as she passed her bus stop. Tiffany sighed, realizing it would be a while before she could return home because of her good gusto. After sending her mom a text message saying goodnight, she thought about everything and nothing. Thoughts about work were replaced by thoughts about the need to arrange her personal life, and then switched to thoughts that by Friday, with the established heat, planting at the dacha would be difficult. Finally, the bus brought Tiffany and Adrien to their desired stop. After a short walk down a nearly unlit street, the girls stopped at a ramshackle cottage. Before Adrien could even get the key out, the door swung open. A woman in a stretchy t-shirt and tight shorts and bicycle shorts came out and started yelling. "What are you doing, Adrien? Where's the money your father gave you? I called him and I know you left him, and I thought you'd run away after you'd made a fortune. I thought I'd put out a bolo." Behind the shrieking woman came a group of skinny children, a girl about the same age as Adrien, a boy a little younger, and a tiny little girl who crawled after the older ones. Adrien began to ramble on and on about the situation she was in. Tiffany froze, unable to say anything or even move. Dumbfounded by what she saw, Tiffany wanted to turn around and walk away, but her legs felt like they were stuck to the pavement. The woman shouting at Adrien was very familiar to her. It was her former best friend, and now nemesis Laurel Gordieva. Years ago, she had separated Tiffany from Damien, her first strong love. Now, from the height of her age, Tiffany realized she shouldn't have shared personal secrets with Laurel. But back then, at the tender age of 16, she believed in an unbreakable friendship and was embarrassed to discuss sensitive topics with her mother and grandmother. Laurel learned from Tiffany herself that Damien insisted on intimacy, arguing that they would definitely get married when his beloved turned 18. So what did it matter when they became intimate? Tiffany was almost in agreement. The guy's arguments seemed convincing, and she was ready to forget the moral principles instilled by her older relatives. She kept humming the naive popular song about the airplane in love, the lines of which accurately described her story, "I love you, Damien." Tiffany wanted a guy who didn't doubt her feelings. The only hitch was wanting to make the first time something special, which made the preparations take longer. But while she doubted and planned, Laurel acted. As a result, a little embarrassed, Damien, who came to the date, announced to Tiffany that he was dumping her. "Understand, it's not about you. You're a great person, and you'll easily find your happiness." He said something else in the same vein, but the girl didn't seem to hear. Then she turned and ran, not noticing the puddles under her feet. Of course, Tiffany rushed to Laurel, hoping for support and advice on how to get her boyfriend back. But instead of sympathy, she heard the hard truth. Tiffany remembered Laurel telling her, "Tiffany, Damien and I are together now. I happen to be expecting a child with him. You don't take offense, okay, with that announcement?" It was as if Tiffany's entire upbringing had evaporated. She could hardly remember a tenth of what she'd said to her friend who'd become an ex-girlfriend overnight. But people who stabbed her in the back were a nightmare to forget. Luckily, Damien's father was in the military. Thanks to that, the traders hadn't been in town long. Laurel had already left with a noticeable belly on her normally slender figure to follow her lawfully wedded husband, Damien. Tiffany tried not to think about the insolent trader and the despicable friend. For a long time, she kept away from the male sex, communicating only dryly and only on business, except for her mother and grandmother. Tiffany calculated that it had been 15 years since that bitter 17th year. That was how long she hadn't seen Laurel or Damien, and she purposely changed the subject whenever someone she knew started talking about them. Catherine, accidentally meeting Tiffany on the street, once tried to talk to her. However, the proud girl said she had to run away. Catherine then, according to rumors, went to her daughter. But Tiffany did not care, only to never see or hear about the traitors again. The girl suffered, experiencing everything deep inside herself, and only her future husband Andrew was able to melt the ice in her heart. He conquered with politeness, care, the ability to reason on various topics. Tiffany responded to his advances, realizing that the emergence of sympathy influenced the fear of being a lonely old maid after the betrayal. Tiffany married Andrew, probably only because he was the opposite of Damien, both in appearance and in character. But still, their life together didn't work out. Tiffany was about to leave, but suddenly Laurel turned her attention from the nearly crying Oberon to her and shouted just as loudly, though more joyfully. "Tiffany, oh shit, that's right, Tiffany, it's you. I'm looking at you, I'm looking at you, I'm looking at you, I'm looking at you, I'm looking at you. And you're still beautiful. Good for you. You haven't changed much, but you look a little tired. Come in. As if you're not my dear, come in." Barely knocking down Oberon, who was standing in front of Tiffany, Laurel grabbed her old friend by the wrist as she was holding her bags and pulled her inside the house. Come in, come in. Hurry up and sit and talk. It's been so long since we've seen each other. I have 4 children already. How about you?" Tiffany was shocked, because suddenly realized that Laurel does not suffer even a shadow of shame for what happened between them in the past. "What are you looking at?" "Hey," the hostess shouted at her older children. "Matthew, take Janie to the playpen in the nursery. Put her in the playpen. Stacy, Oberon, into the kitchen now. Peel the potatoes quickly. Put the water on the fire. We'll talk to you later." "Oberon, will you pay me back for my transgression? I sent you on such an important task as an adult and you ruined it. Now you're going to sit on cards and boxes." No matter how Tiffany tried to explain to her ex-girlfriend that she had no time, that she had to go home, it was as if her words never reached Laurel. As soon as the peeled potatoes were in the boiling water, her mother shouted at her elders. "Everyone run away from here quickly. Stay in the nursery and don't make a sound. Do not prevent us from sitting and chatting." You see, Laurel said to Tiffany, 4 kids and you have to be in charge, or there's no escape. They're not all the same age. Matthew's 14, Auburn's 12, Max is 5. And Janie will be 2 soon. They all need different kinds of supervision. The atmosphere in the kitchen wasn't very pleasant and didn't lend itself to socializing. Although Tiffany was not a spoiled, refined young lady and could easily have lived in a much smaller space, she was uncomfortable here. Dirty dishes towered in the sink and on the table. The sour odor was unpleasantly associated with a full trash can that seemed to be somewhere in the kitchen. Intercepting the gaze of the unexpected guest, the hostess explained. From the neighboring construction site, the plumbing was damaged. So I'm waiting for them to fix it. Then I'll make the children salt and wash everything. And so, to cook and wash hands, we carry from the column from the neighboring street. Tiffany sat on the not-too-comfortable stool as if hypnotized and looked at Laurel, not understanding how she had turned from a real beauty into a hobbit Alice, a woman of the most disgraceful type. The woman laughed loudly, throwing back her head and talking excitedly. "Oh, Tiffany, you should thank me to the grave that I saved you from such a gift as Damien. I thought his father was a military man, about to take a well-deserved retirement. He'll get an apartment, and we'll move to a nice city somewhere. I had it all worked out so well. But Damien managed to get into a big fight with his father. As a result, we were 6 months away from the baby on our own. When we got a rented room, Damien started to get a bit of a headache, even truant, I'll tell you that. We were too quick to start a family with him. We were so green. In bed, we were okay, but there was nothing to talk about. Damien was kind of contemptuous of me. First in hints, and then he started saying that I'd been messing with him in front of his eyes. I tied him hand and foot with my pregnancy, as if he were a dog on a leash. Wherever they pull him, that's where he goes. Surprised beyond belief, Tiffany didn't know what to say to such revelations. But Laurel just seemed to need to talk. She continued her speech, not noticing that the guest was not comfortable listening to her. In general, soon enough I was bored, in retaliation of course, with a neighbor began to have fun. Everything seemed to be going well, and then one day Damien and I had a fight. He got nervous, started throwing punches at me. My boyfriend smelled the stench of a beef and came out of the room through the hole, his heels glistening. Damien filed for divorce and I didn't fight it. He wasn't that good. All I could get from him was alimony for Laurel and for Adrien, who had conceived in marriage to him. Honestly, I don't know whose it was. I'm having money problems, as it happens. So I sent that silly girl over there for cash today. She was flapping her ears and she didn't have a phone. I got Matthew and Janie from my current husband, but he's almost a drunk. He stays away from home for days at a time. When he comes home, he's not happy either. But they're promising me a new apartment soon. I mean, we just moved here after Damien. We came here to get some extra perks on top of the alimony. He's doing well, the bastard. Found himself a woman who got him a cushy job. The official salary, however, with the Golubkin nose, but the gray is excellent. He's happy with the amount in the envelope every month. I know because I know a friend of mine works at the same company. Anyway, Damien's always willing to help, but he's always shying away. So we have to send the girls to him. He's brain dead when they start begging him. Of course, I was too quick. I gave birth to Stacy and Auburn for free. But with Matthew, it all worked out so well. It's as if they'd made the whole maternity fun thing for him. It was a pity, of course, that it wasn't cash in hand, but at least something to get something out of the unpleasant situation, excuse me. A little benefit. Laurel looked around and saw no other clean dishes except for a tray on which stood an ornate samovar. She quickly moved it directly to the dirty floor and moved the potatoes onto the improvised plate that had been vacated. After that, with her usual deft movement, she took out disposable cups from the cupboard, obviously used many times, and splashed a murky liquid from a bottle into them. Don't be squeamish, Tiffany, it's my husband's drink. I can vouch for its quality, and it drinks like water and doesn't give you a headache in the morning, Laurel said. Let's have a little drink and you can tell me about your life, your hobbies, where you work. And I'm all about me and myself. Listen, do you have kids? You don't look like you do. You don't have a belly. I'm only 6 months older than you. You can see my figure. So what? I'm good. Without waiting for the guest's answer, Laurel confirmed. Of course I'm good. Don't think I'm not bragging, I just don't praise myself as often as I should. You should always praise yourself, you got everything on time. Look at you, Stacy's almost a bride. And I'm still young. Isn't that great? And you, Tiffany, it's time for you to have kids. A woman's clock is ticking. Before you know it, you'll be old and alone. So hurry up and find a man and have a baby, honey. Would you like me to tell Damien out the window that you need help with something so juicy? I don't think he'd say no. He'll help, and then he'll stay out of the way. The baby's yours alone, no strings attached. Otherwise his wife, Jera, would be quick to deal with him. And Damien's no fool to break up a good marriage. So, shall I call? Tiffany's heart was troubled by the advice, the dubious proposal, and the unwelcome meeting with the insolent, unscrupulous Laurel. How dare she even dare give such advice while living in almost complete disarray? Tiffany felt physically suffocating in this environment, and as if awakening from an obsession, she wanted to tell her former friend what she thought. But she was prevented from doing so by the timid voice of Adrien from behind her. Mother, can I have some potatoes? Matthew wants to eat, and I haven't had anything substantial to eat since this morning. Tiffany rose from her stool, making room. Thanks for the offer, Laurel, but I really have to go. Besides, it's probably time for your kids to go to bed, too. Laurel was clearly unhappy that her youngest daughter had interrupted the party. Tiffany noticed that her former friend was barely restraining herself from being rude. Bags of harvested crops stood around the doorstep. Feeling a strange sense of pity, Tiffany pulled out the purse with her keys and wallet that was lying nearby and said, "These, Laurel, are vitamins for your children. Goodbye." The woman left the house of her former friend and, reaching the nearest tree, leaned against the trunk growing on the sidewalk. Memories surged in messy waves, filling her thoughts. How she'd hated Laurel and Damien back then, wished the worst for them. Now by chance she could see how the traders lived in poverty, but she felt no joy. I felt sorry for the children first and foremost, and I didn't feel sorry for Damien and Laurel, whom she had once thought up the most painful punishments for. Tiffany called out to the girl, catching up with her. "Adrien, you still haven't given me a phone number. Please, here's a piece of paper and a pen. Write it down for me." Tiffany had no desire to communicate with anyone related to Laurel, though. She, tired and mentally drained, complied with the girl's request. Adrien smiled, flashing her white teeth in the semi-darkness, and asked, "May I, when I have a phone again, call you sometimes?" "I will." Tiffany nodded and advised, "Go home, Adrien. You've had a rough day. Eat and go to bed." The girl waved her hand and ran home. Tiffany waited until the door closed and hurried to her house. The late hour left no chance of public transportation still running on the city streets. She had to leave the neighborhood filled with construction sites and hurry to get to her own apartment so she could finally rest from the unexpected events. Surprisingly, the woman felt calm, as if a guardian angel had spread its wings over her. After reaching home and taking a shower, she went to bed. Whether because of nervous tension or because of the prolonged vacation at the cottage, but sleep did not come to Tiffany. She counted sheep and used other techniques, but nothing helped. The events of the past came back to her mind, mixing with each other. Tiffany couldn't understand if Laurel had never felt guilty about having crossed the line of decency. Of course, there was no telling how her relationship with Damien would have turned out, but there was a chance it might have been a good one. Maybe they'd have children too. A separate cause for excitement was the fact that the traders now lived in the same city as her. Although it was large, the likelihood of chance encounters increased. The devil dared me to linger at the dacha and then notice the sad girl and help her. If I had known in advance whose daughter Adrien was, I would have passed by or just given money for a ticket. It's true, you can't do good without doing evil, Tiffany thought. With the accompaniment of such disturbing, provoking thoughts, she finally fell into a restless sleep. It was still a cool early summer morning, but it looked like it was going to be another hot day due to the sudden work troubles. Tiffany hadn't even remembered the meeting the night before. But in the evening, during the traditional phone conversation with Maggie's mother, the woman's sadness, again caused by the unpleasant impressions of meeting her ex-girlfriend, had returned. "I'll tell you everything," Maggie said flatly. "Daughter, you've grown up to be a wonderful, merciful person. But remember, when you lend a helping hand, it's important to dodge the kick of gratitude." "Tiffany, I'm begging you, please don't feel sorry for Laurel. She chose her own fate. It's not your fault she has 4 kids now. You gave them vitamins, and that's enough. Don't show acts of support even for the children and feel sorry for Laurel. It's not their fault, of course, but you should stay away from such arch-traitors who sacrifice their friendship for their own happiness. If I understand anything in life, it's that Laurel could hardly have changed for the better. Forget about her and don't think about her. What if she shows up? Send her away. It's a shame you gave her daughter your phone number. But I understand. You're tired. You're confused. It's okay, though. If Laurel has the nerve to call, block her number, and that's it. The less you talk to people like that, the better. You can't expect anything good from a sneaky traitor." Tiffany promised her mom that she would never respond favorably to Laurel's attempts to get close again, and she calmed down a little. Indeed, personally, her Tiffany was clear before her own conscience. She had helped the girl unselfishly, from the heart. And that was the end of it. Perhaps if she had known that she would run into her former friend while walking her home, she would have parted ways with the girl on the street corner and just watched her walk through the door. However, things happened the way they did, and thus there is no need to speculate as to what the if only would have been like. Moreover, no responsibility for Laurel's children is imposed on her by this act. She, Tiffany, is not an angel, a saint, or blessed. She will certainly not be able to forgive the betrayal of even 15 years ago. Nor, of course, is she going to take revenge. No need to dirty her hands and conscience. And she is sick, to be honest. At first it was so painful that it was hard to breathe. But she had endured, survived, restored herself, pulling herself out from under the rubble of her great and bright love. Tiffany had no desire to socialize with people who had suddenly popped up out of the past. Maggie's mother returned from the sanitarium, and the sincere joy and mutual love of seeing a loved one reigned again in their little friendly family. Together, the women celebrated it at their favorite dacha, a small but important event. And life continued according to the long-established order. The rest of the summer passed quietly. For a while, Tiffany was wary of receiving calls from unknown numbers, fearing to hear her daughter Laurel's voice. But gradually that fear receded. The golden fall was bountiful with a bumper crop of apples, and to Tiffany's delight, neither Laurel nor Damien appeared on the horizon. It was with some trepidation that she passed by the plot where she had once met the daughter of a former friend. But in time, that feeling was a thing of the past, especially after she met Alexander. It happened not far from the bus stop. A man in a simple domestic car slowed down when he saw two women pulling carts too slowly and offered a ride. If Maggie hadn't been feeling a little unwell that evening due to the change in weather, the approaching fall, she probably would have found a reason to refuse such a courtesy. Tiffany took charge, however, and after thanking the driver for his indifference, helped her mother into the cabin. By this time, the bags were already in the trunk, carefully stowed there by a helpful man. The driver introduced himself on the way and even took a tonometer out of the glove compartment and handed it to Maggie, suggesting that she take her blood pressure just in case and stop by a hospital or pharmacy if she needed it. The readings were quite acceptable. After asking for the address of the new acquaintances, the man soon drove Maggie and Tiffany to their driveway and then helped carry their bags into the apartment. Alexander refused the offered tea, but gratefully accepted a bag of apples. He also asked Tiffany for her phone number. They began to meet, and Sasha gradually became his own in the small female kingdom, helping as much as he could both at the dacha and in the apartment. Although both Maggie and Tiffany tried not to burden Alexander with their problems, he categorically refused to accept money from them for his help. The only thing that alarmed Maggie was that the man was very sparing about himself. Alexander described his fate punctiliously, schematically, and without details. He was born in one of the republics of the former Soviet Union, and then was forced to leave there with his family. He learned to be an automobile mechanic and got a job. Then he was called up for compulsory military service, went to a hot spot. He came back, got married, divorced, no kids. He works, lives in a rented apartment, but is already looking for an apartment in the mortgage. When Alexander was asked about his relatives, he shut up and asked to give him time to talk about everything himself when he was ready. Thus, Tiffany, not limited in her fantasies, decided that Alexander had some tragedy in his past that was still painful and difficult for him to remember. Maggie felt a slight distrust of her new acquaintance. Too easily he found common ground with her daughter. Alexander liked the same music and movies as Tiffany. He could easily continue a sentence she started, and often fully agreed with any of her opinions. The man didn't force things, but he also became more and more firmly established in Tiffany's life. It got to the point where he drove her to work, brought her home, drove her to and from the cottage. At first, Maggie accepted the man favorably, but gradually her gratitude for his help was replaced by wariness too impeccable, he seemed to her. Alexander was overly polite, always tidy, and without the slightest sign of having worked in a car repair shop. Never had she seen signs of repair on his hands like her ex-husband's, and his desire to constantly monitor Tiffany's movements was disturbing. One day, Maggie decided to share her suspicions with her daughter. "Tiffany, you listen to me calmly. Some too flawless, this Alexander. Everything seems smooth and smooth and smooth, but think about it. When does he manage to work, if almost personal driver for you, and on a voluntary basis? I'm sorry, but I don't believe in altruism in today's world. I don't believe in altruism in today's world." Maybe you're secretly giving him gas money from me. At least Tiffany even took a little offense. Why, just for nothing, gratuitously? Just because he likes me? I'm not an option for a ride. After a moment's silence, the young woman tried to smooth out the harshness of the said phrase, and, as if surprised, confessed. In general, I offered Alex to pay the expenses, but he flatly refused. I think, Mom, you're worrying for nothing. Don't you and I deserve to meet a good, unselfish man? Maggie wanted to believe in a miracle, but she tried to convince her daughter not to be so quick to open her heart to Alex. That's right. You certainly deserve happiness, but don't rush, think it over calmly. After all, Alex does not show any details of his life, any emotions about the situation in the past and present. When I begin to question him, he evades answers or says what we have already heard from him, as if an actor who has studied his role and adheres to it without any improvisations. Not once has he snapped, not once has he said anything unnecessary. Okay, I understand it can be hard to remember the war, but otherwise, why is he so reserved? Tiffany only grumbled at such a claim. Mom, I can't get enough of you. Remember about Andrew? You told me he was too loose? Alex is reserved, a little verbal, and you're not like that again. Maggie wasn't glad she'd had this conversation with her daughter, and she certainly hadn't expected it to lead to a fight, splitting their understanding, which had seemed unshakable. Tiffany retreated to her room, showing that she had no intention of continuing this conversation any further. And her mom wondered. Maybe she really wasn't being entirely objective about Alex, really, but there was a chance that he was a man of business and not inclined to be candid about himself, and her suspicions were aroused by her mother's jealousy. No, Maggie decided, I would no longer interfere with my daughter's relationship with her chosen man, but I would keep a close eye on him, so as not to miss any alarm bells. Maggie pondered. So what if Tiffany is already in her 4th decade? To me, she'll always be my favorite little girl, the one I'll always protect. The woman's doubts hadn't disappeared, but now she stopped troubling her daughter with her speculations. No matter how Maggie felt about Alex, she couldn't help but admit that it would have been much more difficult to prepare the cottage for winter without his help. The man diligently fulfilled all the requests and even made reasonable suggestions. He clearly had experience in this kind of work. But Alex again gracefully evaded answering the question about where he had learned all the wisdom of dacha management. About a week before the festive New Year's Eve party, the man brought a slender fir tree with fluffy short needles to Tiffany's apartment, explaining, I thought that you grow all sorts of flowers at the cottage yourself, and it would be silly to give their Dutch counterparts. And kind of more thematic, Tiffany tucked the fragrant beauty into a vacant corner and asked, why do you have to give flowers today, which of course are less spectacular than a Christmas tree? There was a touch of resentment in Alex's voice. How is it, Tiffany, that you don't remember that today is exactly 3 months since we met so casually but happily? It has become a very important event for ME.3. Tiffany was confused. I'm sorry, Alex, I'm sorry, but we've had a busy New Year's Eve at the firm, so it slipped my mind. No offense. The man smiled and admitted not at all. I read somewhere that resentment is the province of petty people. So, honey, I'm not even offended. In fact, I just wanted to do something nice for you. And since there was a Christmas tree market on the way, I thought a tree would be perfect. Maggie, listening to the conversation between her daughter and her boyfriend, was ashamed of her doubts about Alex. He sounded very convincing. Besides, the man had quietly agreed to spend the holiday with Tiffany and her mom. Part of Maggie's suspicions that Alex was married had been planted. Would a family man be so easily excused from being at home at a set table with his relatives? Hardly. On the festive evening, Alex gave Maggie a beautiful shawl in the Pavlov-Posadzki style, and Tiffany presented her with perfume. 15 minutes before midnight, the man asked for some attention and made an unusually long speech for him. Dear Maggie and Tiffany, in the past year, the most significant event for me was the chance encounter I had with you. And I think it was the greatest good fortune of my life. In fact, it was only because of you that I realized what true family support and the warmth of home means. I would love to see Tiffany enter the coming year already in her new status. I'm sorry I'm worried. The man touched, then turned to Tiffany and her mom. Maggie, please, your daughter's hands. Believe me, she'll have no reason to be displeased with me. Do you mind? Maggie looked questioningly at her daughter with happy eyes that sparkled brighter than the lights on a Christmas tree and shrugged. I think, Alex, it's worth asking Tiffany's opinion as well. Whatever she decides is the way to go. Alex nodded in agreement with the woman's words, pulled a box out of his pocket, and opening it, showed it to Tiffany. Let me put it on for you as a token of our engagement. Tiffany smiled shyly, holding out her hand to the man. Maggie wiped the corners of her eyes, trying not to smear her mascara. At the party table, Alex began to suggest options for the celebration. I think it makes sense to choose a wedding date closer to summer, sit in a cafe, and then go on vacation to your Maggie, wonderful dacha, partly thanks to which our acquaintance took place. After that, frankly, I'd like to go to the seaside for a week or so. How would you feel about that? Tiffany, will you be able to get a vacation this summer? Tiffany glowed and was already mentally calculating what period to ask her bosses for. Then she suddenly realized. Mom, how are you going to deal with the cottage in my absence? Maggie waved her hands. Oh, don't worry about that. Dacha should be a pleasure, not a chore. Plan your holiday as you see fit. By the way, Alex, we should probably notify your relatives about such an important event and get to know them in general. It wouldn't hurt. It was obvious from Alex's pale face that Maggie had touched on a sore subject, but he replied. Alas, I have no one to introduce you to. I'm sorry, but this is a somewhat sore subject for me. I'm going to go to the landing for some air. The man left the table, and Tiffany whispered indignantly to her mother. Why did you have to ruin Alex's mood? Everything was going so great. He seems to have some unpleasant memories of the loss of his loved ones. You and I have talked about this before, haven't we? Maggie began to apologize. Daughter, I didn't mean to offend Alex. That's it. I won't ask another question. Don't worry, Tiffany replied. When Alex returned to the table, he was behaving as if nothing had happened, and the festivities returned to a pleasant course. In their joint minds, they decided to get married in the spring and April and postpone the wedding trip until the velvet season. The days of the coming year flew by. Alex even began to take Tiffany to look at apartments. However, out of all the abundance of options, there was no perfect match. Maggie was happy for her daughter, but made another attempt to check Alex's identity. The man's social networking page was boring and devoid of any hints about his relatives. He published photos of cars that he happened to repair, arranged reposts with contests. The woman did not notice anything objectionable and quietly began to prepare for the upcoming wedding of her daughter. One day, Alex picked Tiffany up after work, as usual, and the woman noticed that her fiancé was even more taciturn than usual. Watching him from the passenger seat, she could see the man's eyebrows furrowed and his jowls playing. The atmosphere in the interior of the car was tense, and unable to stand it, the woman asked, Alex, what's going on? Is something wrong? Is there anything I can do to help? The man turned off the avenue into the mall parking lot, stopped the car, and turned around to Tiffany. Alex didn't look like the happy groom preparing to say goodbye to his bachelorhood. After a moment's silence, he spoke. Tiffany, I have a serious problem. The wedding may have to be postponed. Tiffany was startled. What happened? And Alex, looking his bride in the eye, shared his problems. In order to make more money, I've started moonlighting at one other place for cash in addition to my usual garage service. So on the night of today, burned boxes, in which stood driven to repair cars to which I had access, and some even repaired. Anyway, they decided to hold me responsible for the fire. The amount I have to pay is huge. I've already given all my savings, but it's like a drop in the ocean. I've been going to banks all day, but with the salary I can show officially. There are no decent offers. They threaten to cripple me and even find other ways to influence me. I'm terribly afraid that you or your mom might get hurt because of these scoundrels. Tiffany was shocked. She had seen a report on the city's news site about a fire in the industrial area, but she had no idea that this emergency would affect her so closely. The woman ran a soothing gesture across her fiancé's cheek and tried to say absolutely calmly, "So it's no trouble. We won't cancel anything. Now I will transfer you money from my card, so that you at least part of the debt paid. We will go to apply exactly on the day we planned, and we will play the wedding without making changes and postponements. The only thing is, we'll have to sacrifice some fun. But it's not a big deal. It is quite possible to do without a banquet and a trip to the sea. Life is long. We'll have time for everything. Alex intercepted Tiffany's hand and began to shower her with kisses. Thank you, sweetheart, for your support. We'll see. Maybe the insurance company will figure it out and the claim against me will be dropped. Of course, that would be the best option. The man turned off the avenue into the mall parking lot and stopped the car. He turned around to Tiffany. Alex didn't look like the happy groom preparing to say goodbye to bachelorhood. After a moment's silence, he spoke. Tiffany, I have a serious problem. The wedding may have to be postponed. Tiffany was startled. What happened? Alex, looking his bride in the eye, shared his problems. In order to make more money, I've started moonlighting at one other place for cash in addition to my usual garage service. So on the night of today, burned boxes in which there were cars for repair, to which I had access and some even repaired. Anyway, they decided to hold me responsible for the fire. The amount I have to pay is huge. I've already given all my savings, but it's a drop in the ocean. I've been going to banks all day, but with the salary I can show officially. There are no decent offers. They threaten to cripple me and even find other ways to influence me. I'm terribly afraid that you or your mom Maggie might get hurt because of these rascals. Tiffany was shocked. She had seen a report on the city news site about a fire in the industrial area, but she had no idea that this emergency would affect her so closely. She ran a soothing gesture across her fiancé's cheek and tried to say absolutely calmly, "It's no trouble at all. We won't cancel anything. Now I will transfer you money from my card so that you at least part of the debt paid. We will go to apply for the application exactly on the day when we planned, and we will play the wedding without changes and delays. The only thing is, we'll have to sacrifice some fun, but it's not a big deal. It is quite possible to do without a banquet and travel. Life is long. We'll have time for everything." Alex intercepted Tiffany's hand and began to shower her with kisses. Thank you, sweetheart, for your support. But with a rough idea of how this whole insurance business works, it's likely that the payout will be denied or come a few years later. So it is desirable and not to count on it to avoid disappointment. The lovers sat a little more in the car, and then Alex delivered the bride to the house. Running in to visit, he flatly refused. Sorry, my dear, I'll stay in one more place now. Maybe I can earn some money there. You and I have every penny we have now. Tiffany smiled encouragingly and kissed her fiancé. Alex, just don't overwork yourself. Don't work too hard. At home, Tiffany told Maggie's mom about the trouble Alex had gotten into and asked, "Do you think maybe we should hire a lawyer to at least try to reduce the amount of damages allegedly caused by Alex?" Maggie was shocked. She had been so taught by her father, Tiffany's grandfather, that a real man tried not to burden a woman he cared about with his problems. At the same time, she was well aware that the semi-criminal businessmen Alex worked for were quite capable of acting by any means necessary, often choosing the illegal but most effective ones. Alex could not see his fiancée for the next few days, and warned her about it by phone. "My golden, I was offered a well-paid part-time job, but I will have to go out of town. So I'm sorry I can't even get away to drive you to and from work." Tiffany took this with complete understanding. She was encouraged that the man she loved was not desperate, but was trying to work his way out of a difficult situation. She said a warm farewell to Alex and began to think about how else she could help him. Taking advantage of the few days of respite, mother and daughter began to collect at least part of the necessary amount. They had opened bank accounts, and even if it was not enough, but at least the debt would gradually decrease. Having withdrawn the money, the women took it home with all precautions and waited for Alex to show up. The man called a couple of days later, and Tiffany cheerfully informed him that she and her mother had collected another part of the money. Alex thanked her tirelessly, and it even seemed to the woman that he was barely holding back tears. "Tiffany, my love," he said, "how grateful I am to you and Maggie. I'll probably be back in town the day after tomorrow so I can finally hold you. I'll be able to sell my car, and if all goes well, we'll have a little money left over for the party. It may not be as lavish as I dreamed of throwing you, but still. It was only after the call ended that Tiffany realized how much she missed her lover. She needed him like air, although it seemed like not much time had passed since they had met. Seeing that her daughter was still anxious, Maggie tried to turn her thoughts to something pleasant. "Listen, I've got a lovely piece of fabric in my pantry," she said. "Grandma Janie got it for the occasion. Let's take a look at it and think of a dress for the wedding." Tiffany grinned. "Mom, this isn't your first time getting married. I don't need a white dress." Maggie parried. "Well, did I say the fabric was white? It's just a lovely turquoise shade that I think will suit you perfectly." Over the cares and gentle arguments about the dress, the women were a little distracted from their unpleasant worries. After all, when the hands and head are busy with the creative process, everything else seems to reduce the scale of its importance. Maggie had gone to the store when Tiffany's phone suddenly rang with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. The woman usually rejected such calls and did so this time. However, the unknown person or persons unknown did not persist. When the trill sounded once again, Tiffany answered. "Listening." The young voice coming from the speakers was ringing, but somehow joyful. "Hello, Tiffany. This is Adrien, Laurel's daughter. We can meet somewhere crowded now so we can avoid causing unnecessary interest." Tiffany was surprised. She didn't think she would ever have to socialize with her daughter again. Sworn friends, and she didn't take too kindly to that. "Maybe you can explain to me over the phone what this is all about." The girl's voice turned to a whisper. "I can't say it over the phone. Please, let's meet at some mall." Tiffany gave in, and soon she and Adrien arranged to meet at the food court of the mall closest to the woman's home. Back home, Maggie was surprised that her daughter was going somewhere but didn't question her. In fact, Tiffany couldn't explain what was driving her to go to this meeting. She recognized Adrien from afar. The girl was sitting bent over again, as she had been that summer evening, as if she were burdened with some complex, unchildlike problem. Tiffany walked over and said hello. "Hi, Adrien. How are you?" The girl looked up and, after saying hello back, blurted out in a cursive voice. "Tiffany, in general, I don't need to explain long. Don't give Alex any money. He's a liar." The woman marveled. "Why do you say that?" Tiffany's eyes widened. She didn't understand what was going on, and clarified. "Wait, Adrien, how do you know about Alex asking me for money? How do you know about him?" The girl was silent for a moment, then confessed. "Tiffany, in general, I'm ashamed to tell you, but your acquaintance with Alex was invented and organized by my mother. She's mad at you for some reason, when I figured it was supposed to be the other way around. So my mom decided to cash in. She said it's no good without a sucker. So she enlisted this Alex guy to help her plan. He's somehow connected to my stepfather, Archie, Matthew and Janie's father. I don't know exactly where they met, either in an orphanage or when he was in juvie. Anyway, I overheard about their scheme yesterday. Alex is supposed to bilk you out of money and disappear. He's already taken the first installment off his card. But he and Archie are sure you're too shy to go to the police. The way that hog Archie squealed yesterday when Alex told him you'd made him another sum. He drove past without a hitch. He persuaded Alex not to come back so you wouldn't think he'd dropped everything and come just for the money. Adrien continued. I've been thinking all night and half the day about whether to tell you or not, and now I've decided to tell you. I don't think you deserve to be treated so meanly. After all, you're the only one who didn't pass me by, responded to my misfortune. Gave me tasty berries. It's not right for good people to be punished by scoundrels. What happened between my mom and you is none of my business. Personally, I do not feel anything bad and partly even consider myself guilty of what is happening now. After all, my mom only became angry with you after you met her." The woman took a deep breath, as if struggling to find the courage to calm the girl. "No, Adrien, it's not your fault. For some reason, your mother has decided to make me her greatest enemy, and you had nothing to do with what she did. Thank you so much for warning me. Otherwise, I would have been in a catastrophic situation, and I would have dragged my mom into it. You can rest easy. No one will know that I figured out Alex with your help. I promise you that. Tiffany thanked Adrien once more, and sometimes struggled to comprehend the meanness, holding a grudge against Laurel's ex-girlfriend. Reaching home, Maggie immediately realized that something terrible had happened to her daughter. She looked so lost. Tiffany emotionally recounted everything that had come to light about Alex and his involvement in Laurel and her husband's devious plan. Maggie listened to the shocking information, pressing her palm to her mouth to keep from bursting into quite fair swearing at the scoundrels. Such perfidy was very hard to believe. When Tiffany fell silent, the woman still couldn't stand it. What on earth is this doing? Why is that nasty Laurel doing this to you? She's been doing bad things since she was a little girl, and she's not afraid that a boomerang for her evil deeds will come and hit her on the head. God, it's a good thing Adrien got in your way. Otherwise, if you happened to run into Laurel in town, who could have prevented her devious plan, Maggie said. Tiffany cried after all. She jumped to her mother and whispered fervently. Were you right in your suspicions? And I was blinded by Alex's concern and hoped that here he was a real, reliable man with whom I could relax, remember my fragility. Even when Andrew said he was leaving me, I wasn't that hurt. He at least honestly admitted that he loved another and cannot live with me. And this swindler for so many months put our vigilance to sleep, deceived us. How can we trust people now? Mom, I don't even feel sorry for the money I immediately transferred to him when I found out about the imaginary problems. It's just a damn shame that I was so easily fooled. Why was I so gullible? Maggie clasped her daughter tightly to herself, as in her childhood, and tried to speak convincingly and calmly. People with a pure soul is difficult to believe that they are surrounded by scoundrels. You are scolding yourself for nothing. That Alex was very convincing, because even I fell for his tricks. Talent, minus the minus. You know, let's consider that the money you transferred to him, it's not his illegal booty, and quite fair payment for services for the repair of our cottage and apartment. From that point of view, we haven't suffered at all. So you could say we got off cheap. And one more lesson we learned: you should trust your intuition. If there's the slightest suspicion, you have to be more thorough. There were obvious oddities in Alex's behavior, but we chose to ignore them. We should have insisted that he introduced at least you to his relatives, friends, go to his work, visit the hostel where he lives, talk to the neighbors. Maggie's musings were interrupted by a phone call. It was Alex, who had traditionally called Tiffany to say goodnight, to say the usual compliments and declarations of love. But now the woman realized the true cost of those words, all lies. Contrary to custom, she was in no hurry to answer the man. She just didn't know how to go on, living, and what exactly to say to the man who had taken advantage of her gullibility and intended to rob her completely. Tiffany was afraid that Alex would realize from her voice that she had been exposed. Maggie answered instead. Hello, Alex. Tiffany went out to her neighbor's house and forgot her phone. Can I take a message? Alex was polite and courteous as always. Thank you, Maggie. If you can have her call me back anytime. As soon as she gets back, I'll be waiting. Goodbye. Goodbye. The woman echoed the male caller. Goodbye. The conversation ended, and Tiffany looked longingly at her mother and asked, How can you lie so skillfully? You're so polite, so perfect. I wanted to scream that they miscalculated and won't get another penny from you and me. But we have to make sure we don't let Adrien down. Judging by Laurel's skill at making mischief, she wouldn't spare her own daughter for outsiders. She'll be in trouble if anyone realizes she warned me. I don't want to hurt such a sincerely honest girl. Maggie realized that Tiffany didn't expect an answer, so she didn't hurry to say anything. In fact, she needed to think it over. The women sat hugging each other, as if drawing support and strength from each other to withstand the betrayal that had befallen them. Eventually, Maggie began to speak carefully, choosing her words. I don't think you should talk to Alex on the phone today. Text him that you're tired, especially since it's the truth, and that you'll wait for him here at our place. He's supposed to be here tomorrow, Saturday. Tiffany nodded, and Maggie continued to share her plan. Great. So tomorrow morning, you and I will go and deposit the money in the bank. Then I'll ask a coworker to come along as a power backup, Maggie continued. I think that if you confidently tell Alex that you can no longer support him financially, he won't insist or influence us in any way. Of course, ideally not to drag him home, but somewhere in a cafe to meet. Then I personally see two options. Either immediately shock him with the news that his fraud has been uncovered, but then his reaction could be unpredictable. What if he starts fighting? A more interesting game will turn out if you have a little fun, that is. And to lead Alex by the nose. Lie, for example, that the money was urgently transferred to the treatment of a child seen on TV. I think that would be a terrible blow to him. What do you think? Tiffany's eyes twinkled with malice. Mom, I have another idea. Remember those joke bank bills we had lying around that you got at work for your birthday as a joke? I suggest we give Alex a packet of fake money. I don't think he's going to authenticate the loot in front of us. And when he gets to his lair with it, I wonder how he'll defend himself to his accomplices. I doubt Laurel will believe him if he says he got those papers from me. I mean, she thinks I'm a sucker. I think I'm guaranteed a showdown with Alex. Maggie approved of her daughter's plan. That's a neat idea. I wouldn't have thought of that. But I don't want to see him in our apartment anyway. Why don't we run into him somewhere on the way to the cottage? You'll give him the money and we'll go to the cottage. Even if there's no work there now, except to put snow in the tank. But I think we'll feel better in the air. Physical labor will help take our minds off things. Tiffany agreed and then added, Mom, we should probably change the locks first, just to be safe. Remember, I gave Alex the sets for the apartment and the cottage just in case. The woman responded instantly. Maggie approved of her daughter. Good for you, good thinking. I'll call Valentin Antonovich and ask him to help. While Maggie was making arrangements with her colleague, Tiffany watched with unexpected joy as her mother's cheeks blushed sweetly during what seemed to be a very serious, not romantic, conversation. At least let her be lucky and love, the woman thought. Mom deserved to have a holiday on her street too. Otherwise, I can't understand where justice is in life at all. Valentin Antonovich quickly got to his colleague's apartment and soon was already dealing with the task at hand. Watching the working man and her mother, Tiffany clearly noticed that there was a strong mutual sympathy between them. Valentin did not refuse to have dinner at the hospitable apartment or to go to the dacha together the next morning. Maggie briefly, without details, told about the upcoming event, and the man said sternly, The idea is great, but still, for the sake of order, I would still to the police to file a fraud report. At least maybe these swindlers are still wanted for some crimes. And in general, if they are not even brought to justice, so at least they'll grind their nerves. That's good. After Maggie saw the guest off, Tiffany asked her mother, Did you notice the looks Valentin Antonovich was throwing at you? The woman was visibly embarrassed. Oh, you say that too, we're just buddies. Though of course I like him very much. But I somehow already got used to live without a man in my space. Even somehow I remember with horror what it was like constantly ironing shirts, looking for paired socks, cooking with huge pots. No, that kind of selflessness mode is only possible when there is love or strong financial motivation. Why are you looking at me like that, daughter? Alas, but in today's world, financial backing is the perfect fertilizer, you might say, for romantic relationships. A very happy partnership can be cultivated. Pardon the gardening comparisons. Tiffany even laughed. Maggie, I thought you were a romantic lady, but you're a practical and rational gardener. I would strongly advise you to look at Vincent, though. Of course, I'm not very intuitive, but he seemed very nice, sincere, and in love with you. The women once again carefully considered all the details of the upcoming prank. Having exposed the con artist, who did not yet know about his failure, Tiffany began to type a message. Alex's reply didn't take long to arrive. Can't wait for tomorrow, I'm so excited to meet you. Kisses, love. I can't wait to see you and hug you. We can't wait to see you and hug you. Maggie grinned. It's going to be an unforgettable meeting. Tiffany, Maggie, and Vincent met beforehand. The man told what he'd learned through his acquaintances in the burned-out garages. No work had been done to the cars. This argument was important so that none of the crooks would think that Tiffany had been told about the scam by someone in the Laurel family. The fighters for justice came to the stop, where the transfer of fake money was to take place, a little earlier. But the cash-hungry Alex also arrived early. He had to park his car a little farther away to avoid possible disputes and conflicts with the traffic police. Alex almost ran to his eager bride and her escort, greeting the stranger with a friendly hello. The groom nestled his lips against the bride's cheek, kissed Maggie's hand, and thankfully paid no attention to how the women roared. Alex then received a small package from Tiffany's hands. "Honey, this is everything Mommy and I have managed to collect. We just don't have anywhere else to take it. Unless we put the apartment or the cottage up for sale." Alex rushed back to kiss Maggie's hand. "Maggie, I appreciate your affection, but don't make such a sacrifice for me. Especially since with this amount of money I'll be able to satisfy the main part of the claims. Look, maybe I should write you a receipt." "Calling to the aid of all self-control," the woman replied. "What are you, Alex? What kind of receipts can there be between close people? You are going to become a part of our family, aren't you? I intend to entrust you with the most precious thing, my only daughter." "What's that compared to her?" "Some money. Think of it as our family budget. We'd give up everything we have to get you out of harm's way. Money's just a piece of paper compared to your health. And ours and Tiffany's, by the way. Back in the 90s, you could have lost your life for less. There's no way we're willing to do that. So go pay off those bastards and come to Ryan's cottage and we'll make a life. Boil some tea in the cauldron. We'll have a rest after all these worries." Alex hugged his fiancée, shook Vincent's hand, and hurried to his car. Tiffany and Maggie sighed unabashedly. The revenge scene they'd devised was as precise as if they'd rehearsed it many times. "Maggie, I can only imagine the fuss that will ensue when those who've been trying to scam us find the doll instead of real money," Tiffany giggled. "I know. Too bad we won't be able to see their faces," her daughter said. Vincent, watching his companions having fun, advised. "Well, to the cottage or to the police station. I'm going to file a report on this gang." Maggie looked at her daughter and voiced her decision. "Of course, the cottage. We all discussed this situation. After all, analogs on the internet searched to represent the prospects of punishment of these swindlers. The results were not very encouraging. Tiffany transferred money to a private person voluntarily, without coercion. Proving that this Alex was scamming my daughter about his difficult situation will be nearly impossible. So we'll just have to watch how and what this Alex will say when it is discovered that the bills are not real." The call from Alex came almost as soon as the trio of resourceful vigilantes reached the cottage. Tiffany took the call, putting her smartphone on speaker. Everyone prepared to listen to the hapless con artist. "Tiffany, honey, there's been an emergency. Did the bank give you the money?" Tiffany tried to put a note of excitement in her voice. "Yes, I got the money at the bank branch, the one next door on the first floor." "What happened?" Alex kept asking. "Tiffany, didn't you and your mom count the money?" The woman was indignant. "Of course. What if there was a technical error, a malfunction of this machine that counts money? Everything was counted thoroughly. Then, as I told you, I put everything in a bag. What happened?" The man wouldn't answer or back off, trying to find out the truth. Tiffany. Oh my goodness. Did you leave a bag anywhere? By any chance? Maybe you went to the store?" Maggie and Vincent could barely contain their laughter. Tiffany continued her cold-blooded mockery of a cheater in trouble. "Oh, Alex, I was so upset, so worried about you, I don't remember what I was doing. Okay, hold on, let me try to remember it minute by minute. My mom and I went into the bank one after the other. We got cash from the same teller. Then I put all the wads in the bag I gave you today. Oh, of course they counted them. First they asked us to seal it with a piece of paper. We said no, but they gave us banker's rubbers. Then Mom went to work. She got a part-time job so she could give you and me a wedding present. Oh, I remember exactly. I went to the store." Alex sounded hysterical. "Tiffany, did you leave a bag in the locker?" The woman's outrage was almost genuine. "Alex, do you think I'm an idiot? I was carrying the bag behind my back so no one would get to it. I bought candy because I'm stressed out. I always crave sweets. Then I went home. The interrogation continued. Someone could have broken into the apartment. That man who was standing with you and Maggie today, who was he? And wasn't he at your house after receiving the money? It was getting harder and harder for Tiffany to stay calm, but she kept her cool, proving that she'd been in the theater club at school for a reason, and had even received a few honorary degrees. Well, actually, my mom trusts Vincent completely. He's a co-worker of hers. He's been to our house, but he didn't have access to the package, if that's what you're implying. Alex continued to insist. Tiffany, you're scaring me. What the hell happened? Alex lost patience and flared up. What happened? What happened? Instead of real money, the bag contained gimmick bank tickets and rubber bands. So I'm trying to figure out where, at what point the real bills were switched. Come on, think back. How could this happen? You realize how much depends on it. Who would have access to the package? Tiffany was already sobbing with laughter, but she continued to play the brazen con artist. Oh, what a nightmare. How could it be? Sweetheart, listen, maybe you can drop this package off for me now, and I'll go to the police with it. Let them, as it is called, take fingerprints, as they're then fat traces, as in the TV series, allocate and determine who else touched the package, except me. Not a sound came from the speaker. It looked like Alex was gesturing to Peter and Andrew. And after a few seconds he said, Listen, so I tore the package to shreds out of anger and confusion. There probably won't be anyone's footprints there but mine. I don't think the police will be able to help, and even if they do, it'll take them a long time to solve this case. I've got a debt to repay. I promised I'd pay back as much as I could today. Jesus Christ, what are we going to do now? Tiffany, wiping away her tears, replied coldly. I'll tell you what to do, Alex. Forget me forever. And don't try to get revenge or do anything sneaky, meaning I'll go to the police and report you for attempted fraud. You think it was so hard to check if you worked at the burned-out garage? You never even showed up. So goodbye, Alex. Thanks for the lesson. Keep the money I gave you. For your efforts. How long have you been driving me around? Resourceful. Kind of earned it. At the end of the speech, Tiffany's nerves began to give way, and she hurriedly pressed disconnect, not listening to any excuses from Alex, who began to shout that she had simply misunderstood him. With a calm heart, the woman blocked the now definitely ex-fiance's number and offered Maggie and Vincent's mom. I think we did a great job, and there's reason to celebrate the triumph of justice and my release. Maggie modestly added, Daughter, there is another occasion. Vincent and I have decided to get married. At her mother's wedding, Tiffany met Jason, the elegant groom's nephew. The companionship developed with Maggie's full approval. Tiffany, who now relied unquestioningly on her mom's opinion, allowed herself to trust a man again. It wasn't easy, but life went on. And there was no reason for her to shut herself in her loneliness because of the scoundrels who got in the way. 6 months later, Jason proposed to Tiffany, and she said yes. The story of the sneaky Laurel and the cheating Alex was a thing of the past. The only person the happy woman would like to see again is Oberon, who helped her get out of the almost hopeless situation.